The Vikings vanished 1,000 years ago, or did they? What if their blood still flows in millions today? Could their daring voyages explain secrets hidden in your DNA? Step closer. Watch carefully. You may carry the spirit of the North within you. Are you ready to find out? The winds howl across the fjords, carving echoes into stone cliffs that have stood since the Ice Age. You can almost hear the whisper of longboats pushing through cold waters, their wooden hulls creaking as warriors and farmers alike set forth into a world that barely knew their names. But what they left behind was not only fire, iron, and stories etched into sagas. They left blood. They left genes. They left fragments of themselves hidden in the veins of millions alive today. When you look at modern DNA, the surprise is not just in the fact that Viking markers endure in Scandinavia. Of course they do, in Norway, in Sweden, in Denmark. But the revelation is that their traces stretch far beyond those rugged lands, far beyond the pine forests and snowy plains that gave them birth. What does it mean to find Viking DNA in places where their ships may never have sailed? What does it mean that their legacy is not confined to raiding, looting, or even ruling, but embedded deep in the code of life? Imagine standing in a crowded city, London, New York, or even Tehran, and realizing that some of the strangers around you carry echoes of those Northmen. Not in their names, not in their languages, but in their very cells. The science of genetics has peeled away the veil of myth, revealing something both simple and profound. Migration was not an accident. It was not merely conquest. It was movement, mixing, and merging that carried Viking genes farther than the sagas could record. At the beginning, though, it all starts in the north. The homeland of the Vikings was a crucible of harsh winters and short summers. A place that demanded resilience, toughness, and adaptability. These qualities shaped not only their bodies but their decisions to sail outward, to risk storm and death for the promise of land and wealth. When scientists dig into ancient graves in Scandinavia, sequencing the DNA from bones weathered by centuries, they find patterns that match living populations. But they also find patterns that match distant lands. The genetic legacy of the Vikings is both a fingerprint and a ripple, something sharp in its origin yet spreading outward in widening circles. Within Scandinavia, the core bloodlines show a blend of earlier hunter-gatherers, Indo-European steppe herders, and local farming communities that had taken root since the Stone Age. The Viking Age was not the birth of their genetics, but a moment when those genetics were carried outward like sparks in the wind. Think of a longboat slicing through the morning mist, the crew unaware that their children, their grandchildren, their distant descendants would seed themselves across continents. The question that follows is not just how far they went, but how deep their presence remains. DNA studies have revealed that up to 6% of people in the United Kingdom carry direct Viking ancestry. In Iceland, the number is far higher, woven into almost every family line. But what astonishes researchers is that the genetic legacy does not stop at Europe. Viking DNA has appeared in North America, in the traces of early settlements, and even in the bloodlines of populations shaped centuries later. How is this possible? Because migrations never travel in one direction only. When Vikings settled, they mixed. They took local wives, they left children behind, they became part of the fabric of new societies. Their bloodlines slipped invisibly into the human stream, resurfacing centuries later when geneticists mapped entire genomes. Consider this: the very idea of the Viking as a separate race or people is misleading. They were never one thing. They were farmers, warriors, merchants, and explorers. Their DNA shows diversity even in their homeland, suggesting that from the very start they were connected to a wider world. Archaeology confirms this. Silver coins from Baghdad, silk from China, beads from the steppes, all found in Viking graves. These artifacts speak of connections. And DNA makes those connections more real, more intimate, because they live on inside us. When you ask, where are the Vikings today? The answer is not in the old fjords or ruined forts. The answer is in living blood. Every heartbeat that carries Viking DNA is a living saga, a continuation of voyages that never truly ended. Yet there is another layer. The endurance of Viking genetics reveals not only where they went but how they lived. For example, their adaptability to cold climates appears as specific genetic markers related to fat storage and metabolism. Traits that help them survive frostbitten winters now echo in descendants across northern lands. But imagine those same traits carried south, into warmer lands, into populations that might not have needed them but absorbed them nonetheless. The story of Viking DNA is not about a static people but about motion. About movement across seas, across rivers, across mountain passes. It is about the exchange of more than goods. It is about the exchange of life itself. And so the question becomes personal. Could you be carrying Viking DNA? Could a sliver of Norse resilience, a fragment of their restless spirit, live in you? The only way to know is to test, but even without a test, the odds are not small if your ancestry lies anywhere in Europe, or even in lands touched by European migration. Because the Vikings seeded themselves into the very rootstock of Europe, and Europe carried those roots outward again during later ages of colonization. The Viking story is not just medieval, it is modern. Their genes did not vanish when their longboats rotted. They traveled further with every wave of migration that followed, hidden inside people who no longer remembered the source. This is why Viking DNA shows up in unlikely places, why researchers speak of ghost lineages that reappear in genomes where history never recorded a raid or a settlement. It is not about conquest. It is about continuity. Bloodlines flow like rivers, sometimes visible, sometimes underground, but always moving forward. And in the north, where it began, the rivers are still strongest. Scandinavian populations today carry higher frequencies of markers linked to Viking ancestry than anywhere else, but those markers are not isolated. They are shared, echoed, reflected in countless others across the globe. A farmer in Denmark in the 9th century could never have imagined that his blood would surface in a Canadian, an American, or even in an Iranian with distant links through trade and marriage centuries ago. But that is what DNA tells us, that the past is never really gone, only hidden in the double helix waiting to be read. So when we speak of bloodlines of the North, we speak not only of origin but of legacy. Not only of ancestors but of living heirs scattered across oceans and continents. And this is only the beginning of the story. The North gave them strength. The seas gave them reach. And DNA gives us proof. Proof that Vikings still walk among us, not as raiders or kings, but as ordinary people who carry extraordinary echoes in their cells. That is the revelation. That is the surprise. The Vikings are not gone. They are here. They are us. The image of the Viking is almost always the same. Horned helmets that never existed. Blood dripping from axes. Monasteries in flames. Priests crying out as longboats slide into view through morning mist. But is that all they were? Were they only raiders, pillagers, destroyers? Or is there another story hidden beneath the ash and smoke? When scientists examine Viking DNA, when archaeologists dig into the earth of old settlements, when historians untangle the records of terrified monks, a more complex truth emerges. The Vikings did not only come to take. They also came to stay. They were not only raiders. They were settlers. They were men who planted grain in new soil, women who raised children in foreign lands, families who blended with locals until the word Viking ceased to mean anything at all. Imagine a longboat landing not with torches raised, but with cattle, seed, and tools. Imagine men building homes beside rivers instead of burning them down. That happened far more than the old chronicles admit. In places like York, in England, Viking DNA is everywhere, not just in the graves of warriors but in the quiet burials of mothers, daughters, farmers, and craftsmen. They came to stay, to farm, to trade. Their legacy is written not only in swords but in kitchens and hearths. And what does DNA tell us about this? It tells us that the Viking Age was not simply an era of violence but an era of transformation. That wherever the longboats touched, bloodlines shifted. In Ireland, studies reveal that Viking men often married into local families, leaving behind surnames that still echo today. In Normandy, what began as raids along the Seine became a permanent Norse duchy, with Viking DNA mixing deeply into French bloodlines. In Scotland and Orkney, entire communities show high percentages of Norse ancestry, proof that the invaders did not vanish after raids but settled, raised generations, and became part of the land. The question then becomes, why did the chroniclers emphasize only the bloodshed? Perhaps because raiders made better stories than settlers. Perhaps because the smoke of burning churches was easier to record than the quiet of plowed fields. But genetics cannot be fooled by drama. DNA preserves what words erased. And the DNA shows us something striking, that Viking women, though fewer in number, traveled farther than once thought. Their remains appear in England, in Russia, even in the far reaches of Greenland. They were not just passive followers of men. They were carriers of culture, of language, of life itself. If Viking DNA is found today in such wide swaths of Europe and beyond, it is not only because of conquest. It is because of settlement. Because they stayed long enough to root themselves into the very soil. Think of the contradictions. The same hand that once swung an axe at a monk's skull later cradled a child born of a local bride. The same man who stormed a coastal village may have died decades later as a respected farmer in the very same land. That is the paradox of Viking identity. Raiders or settlers? The answer is both. And the proof is alive in DNA. Consider how this duality shaped history. In England, Viking rule gave birth to the Danelaw, a region where Norse law and custom blended with Anglo-Saxon tradition. Place names in Yorkshire, Lincolnshire, and beyond still carry Norse roots. And DNA studies confirm that the people who live there today carry higher levels of Viking ancestry than in other regions. In Ireland, Dublin itself began as a Viking stronghold. A trading hub, not just a raiding port. Coins minted there, marriages recorded there, and yes, DNA found there, all reveal a society that was as much Norse as it was Gaelic. The Irish chronicles speak of wars, but the genes speak of unions. The truth lies in the middle. Normandy tells another tale. Granted to a Viking leader named Rollo, it became a permanent settlement of Norsemen who married local women and founded dynasties. Centuries later, their descendants crossed into England as the Normans, reshaping the island's destiny once more. All because raiders became settlers. Because Norse bloodlines took root in French soil. The Orkney Islands and Shetland too show this transformation. Archaeologists have found Viking longhouses built over Pictish foundations. DNA shows replacement in some areas, blending in others. It was not a story of simple extermination but of absorption, of mixture, of evolution. And that is why today, Viking DNA is not confined to Scandinavia but embedded in populations across Europe. Yet the story stretches further still. Raiders who turned into settlers often became bridges between cultures. In Russia, Norsemen became known as the Rus, giving their name to an entire nation. They began as warriors traveling rivers, but they ended as rulers and traders who mixed with Slavic and Finno-Ugric peoples. DNA again reveals their presence, not as overwhelming conquerors but as threads woven into the larger tapestry. The lesson is clear. The Vikings were never one thing. They were never simply destroyers nor simply farmers. They were both. And that duality explains why their genes persist so powerfully today. A raider may kill and leave, but a settler marries, raises children, and shapes the future. So the next time you hear the clash of axes in some old saga, remember too the quiet sound of footsteps on a new farmstead. Remember that the Viking story is not just told in fire but in flesh. And when you wonder if you carry a trace of them, think not only of battlefields but of fields sown with barley. Because the blood of the north flowed into the soil as much as into the sea. And it grew, it endured, it survived. The Vikings did not vanish because they chose not only to raid but to remain. That is why, today, their DNA surprises us in every corner of the map. Not because they burned but because they built. Not because they killed but because they lived. And in living, they left themselves behind, hidden in the helix, waiting for science to uncover their true story. Raiders or settlers? The answer will always be both. And their descendants walk among us still, carrying the proof that the Viking Age never really ended. It simply changed form, moving from axe to plow, from sword to cradle, from fearsome reputation to invisible legacy. And in that shift, their reach extended not just across seas but across centuries. That is why their DNA endures. That is why it is global. That is why, even now, the saga continues. The British Isles stand as one of the most vivid stages where Viking DNA carved its legacy. Here the Norse longboats cut through misty seas, their dragon-headed prows slicing fog, carrying men who would not only raid but also shape the very blood of the islands forever. When scientists today examine genetic maps of England, Scotland, Ireland, and Wales, they see patterns that betray the centuries of Norse presence, patterns invisible to the eye yet etched into the helix of life itself. Did you know that in northern England nearly a quarter of men carry Y chromosome markers linked to Viking ancestry? Did you know that in Orkney and Shetland entire communities still reveal stronger traces of Norse DNA than anywhere outside Scandinavia? These are not myths, these are scientific findings, drawn from the silent testimony of blood. The story begins with terror, yes, for the chronicles remember raids on monasteries, villages, and undefended towns, but DNA tells us what came after. For after the terror came the settlement, and after the settlement came the mingling of families, the weaving of Norse threads into Celtic, Pictish, and Anglo-Saxon cloth. Look at York, the great Viking city once called Jorvik. Its cobbled streets whisper of markets filled with furs, amber, and silver, of homes built in Norse style, of children who spoke words in both Old Norse and Old English. Today, the descendants of those children walk modern streets unaware that their very blood carries the proof of that mingling. In Lincolnshire and Yorkshire, genetic studies reveal higher levels of Scandinavian ancestry than in southern England. This is no coincidence. It reflects the Danelaw, that vast swath of territory under Viking law where settlers intermarried with local communities, creating a hybrid identity both English and Norse. Place names ending in by and Thorpe remain carved into the map, linguistic fossils of a Viking presence, but DNA makes those fossils flesh again. And across the Irish Sea, the story is just as rich. Dublin itself was founded as a Viking stronghold, not only a base for raids but a hub of trade, a settlement where Norse bloodlines mixed with Gaelic ones. When researchers studied Irish genomes, they found a surprising amount of Norse ancestry concentrated along the eastern coast. The Irish annals may lament the burning of churches, but beneath those laments lie marriages, children, and genetic legacies carried forward. A modern Irishman may never know that in his veins flows a fragment of Norse resilience, a shard of Scandinavian endurance. Move north to Scotland and the evidence grows stronger still. In Orkney, nearly one-third of modern DNA is Norse in origin. That means that when you meet someone in Kirkwall, you are meeting not just a Scot but a living descendant of the Viking world. In Shetland, too, the Norse imprint is unmistakable, with high percentages of Scandinavian ancestry shaping the population even today. These islands, once ruled by earls of Norse descent, remain more genetically Scandinavian than parts of mainland Scotland. And if you turn westward to the Isle of Man, the Norse presence appears again, embedded in both culture and DNA, reminding us that the Viking Age was not only about short bursts of violence but about centuries of integration. What is astonishing is how DNA brings clarity to stories once clouded by myth. When old chroniclers described the fearsome Northmen, they rarely spoke of their children, their marriages, their quiet assimilation into local life. Yet the genes remember what words forgot. The genes prove that the Vikings did not vanish after their age ended but became invisible, part of the very populations that once resisted them. Imagine the irony. A monk who once cursed the Norsemen might have had a great-great-grandchild carrying Norse DNA after generations of unions and exchanges. That is the power of bloodlines, slipping beneath history, shaping lives without leaving written trace. The British Isles today stand as a living laboratory of Viking influence. From the rugged coasts of the Hebrides to the fertile plains of Yorkshire, the Norse imprint endures. And not only in DNA. Words like sky, egg, knife, and husband entered English through Old Norse. Cultural legacies walked hand in hand with genetic ones. But while languages shift and words can be forgotten, DNA does not forget. It carries its record silently, generation after generation, until modern science unravels the code. Consider this. When scientists tested genetic samples across Britain, they discovered a striking north-south divide. Southern England, influenced more by Romans, Anglo-Saxons, and later Normans, showed lower levels of Viking ancestry. But northern England, Scotland, and the Isles bore a heavier Norse imprint, confirming the historical record of settlement in those regions. The match between history and genetics is uncanny, as if the double helix itself were a chronicler writing its own silent saga. Ireland tells a similar story. Though the Norse were eventually absorbed into Gaelic society, their DNA never disappeared. It remained hidden, resurfacing in modern genomes as evidence of the unions that turned raiders into ancestors. When you meet an Irishman with a surname like Doyle, McAuliffe, or even O'Loughlin, you may be meeting the descendant of Viking settlers whose names shifted and merged through centuries of cultural blending. The same applies in England with surnames like Ormsby or Thorpe, silent echoes of Norse roots that lived on both in names and in blood. In Wales, the Norse presence was less pronounced, yet even here Viking raids left genetic traces, though fainter than in other parts of the Isles. It reminds us that even where the Norse seemed brief, their legacy could still survive through a handful of unions that left DNA markers in local populations. Some studies even suggest that coastal communities in Western Wales absorbed Scandinavian ancestry through trade marriages rather than conquest. This shows us that Viking identity was flexible, shifting with circumstance, adapting to opportunity. So what does it mean today when we speak of traces in the British Isles? It means that millions across the United Kingdom and Ireland carry Norse blood without ever knowing it. It means that the story of Viking raids is incomplete unless we also speak of Viking cradles. It means that beneath the national identities of today lies a deeper shared ancestry that ignores borders, laws, and languages. For blood does not care about kingdoms or chronicles. It flows where life demands, mingling silently, carrying fragments of the past into the present. And so, when you stand in York, Dublin, Orkney, or Shetland, when you look around at the faces in the crowd, ask yourself, how many here are unknowingly kin to those dragon-proud ships? How many hearts beat with echoes of fjords, of sagas, of North Sea winds? The answer is more than you think. The Vikings are not gone from the Isles. They are still here, living in the people, living in the streets, living in the double helix of millions. And that is the real surprise. Not the raids we all know, but the bloodlines we forget. The Vikings did not only scar the British Isles with fire. They seeded them with life. And that life endures. When we think of France, we picture cathedrals rising like mountains of stone, vineyards stretching under golden light, and kings draped in velvet. Yet hidden beneath all that elegance lies the rough echo of Norse blood. The Normans, whose very name means Northmen, began as Viking settlers along the Seine, raiders who turned their longboats inland and left terror in their wake. But over time, they became something more than raiders. They became rulers, dukes, and eventually the makers of dynasties that would shape Europe for centuries. The story of Normandy is the story of Vikings becoming French, of Norse DNA merging with Frankish blood, of raiders transformed into nobles who built castles instead of burning towns. How did it begin? Imagine the 9th century, when Viking fleets moved up rivers like hungry wolves, striking Paris, Rouen, and countless villages. The Frankish kings, weary of endless raids, decided not to fight but to negotiate. And so Rollo, a Viking leader, was granted land in 911 under the Treaty of St. Clair-sur-Epte. This land became Normandy, a duchy named for the very Norsemen who once brought fire. What does DNA tell us about this transformation? Genetic studies of northern France reveal Scandinavian markers still present in modern populations, particularly in coastal regions of Normandy where Viking settlers once planted roots. These markers are not overwhelming, but they are unmistakable. They whisper of a past where Norse bloodlines fused with Frankish and Gallo-Roman ones, creating a hybrid people who were neither wholly Scandinavian nor wholly French. They were Normans. And the Normans carried both swords and genes far beyond their duchy. Consider William the Conqueror, himself a descendant of Rollo. When he crossed the English Channel in 1066 and won at Hastings, he not only claimed a crown but also carried Norman DNA into England's ruling class. That DNA had Viking roots, and so through Norman conquest, Viking blood was stitched into the fabric of England once more. Yet the legacy of Norman expansion did not stop there. The Normans spread to Sicily, southern Italy, and even as far as Antioch in the Crusader states, leaving their genetic fingerprints scattered like seeds on foreign soil. What is remarkable is how quickly the Vikings who settled in Normandy adapted. Within a few generations they spoke French, adopted Christianity, and married into local aristocracy. But while culture shifted rapidly, DNA held fast, lingering silently through the centuries. When modern geneticists compare samples from Normandy with those of Scandinavia, they find threads of continuity, proof that the Norse who once raided the Seine did not vanish but were absorbed, their legacy hidden in the veins of farmers, merchants, and nobles alike. But let us step closer. Imagine Rouen, the heart of Viking Normandy, its streets alive with markets where Frankish and Norse merchants traded side by side. Imagine the children of mixed unions growing up speaking both tongues, carrying Viking resilience in their bones but dressed in Frankish fabrics. These children became the first true Normans, hybrids of conquest and settlement, destined to reshape Europe. Their blood tells us that conquest was never a one-way act. It was always an exchange, an absorption, a mingling of lineages. And the mingling carried outward. To this day, scientists detect Scandinavian haplogroups in Normandy at higher levels than in other regions of France, a quiet reminder of those dragon-headed ships that once appeared on the horizon. The chronicles may emphasize Rollo's baptism and William's wars, but DNA remembers the countless unnamed men and women who intermarried, who raised families, who built farms and villages that never made it into chronicles. This is the truest echo of Normandy. The Norman legacy was not just political, it was biological. And through that biology, the Viking presence lived on long after the sagas fell silent. Consider Sicily. When Norman adventurers arrived there in the 11th century, they carved out kingdoms on Mediterranean soil. Their DNA, carrying the Viking imprint through Norman ancestors, mingled with Italians, Greeks, and Arabs, creating one of the most cosmopolitan blends of the medieval world. When we examine Sicilian DNA today, faint Scandinavian signals emerge, like faint ripples from a stone thrown long ago into a wide sea. Those ripples began in Normandy, but their source was the fjords of Scandinavia. This chain of ancestry reminds us that bloodlines are rivers, always flowing, always mixing. Normandy was a confluence where the cold streams of the north met the warmer rivers of Gaul, and from that meeting new currents spread outward. And yet, we must ask, what did it mean for identity? Were the Normans still Vikings? Were they French? Were they something new? The answer is all of these. They carried Viking toughness in their veins, Frankish refinement in their customs, and an entirely new ambition that drove them to conquer not only England but half the Mediterranean. DNA tells us they remained connected to their Scandinavian forebears, but it also tells us they became something different, a people forged in fusion. And that fusion shaped history in ways still visible today. For every time a descendant of William the Conqueror looks back at their genealogy, they trace a line not just to a Norman duke, but to a Viking raider on the Seine. Every time geneticists map populations of Normandy, they see faint but clear Scandinavian shadows that remind us of those dragon-proud ships. Even in the cuisine and language of Normandy, Norse traces survive. Words like cake and skier traveled from the north, while farming techniques carried across the sea influenced local practices. But above all, the DNA proves what culture sometimes forgets, that people do not disappear, they transform. And the transformation of Norsemen into Normans is one of the most powerful examples. When we stand in modern Normandy, amid apple orchards and quiet towns, it is easy to forget the fierce origins of this land. Yet in the people themselves, in their very cells, the Norse presence persists. A farmer in Rouen may never know he carries markers linked to ancient Scandinavia. A teacher in Caen may never guess her ancestors once sailed stormy seas. But the proof is there, etched silently into every generation. The Norman echo is not a ghost. It is a living vibration running through veins, a testament to how Viking DNA reached beyond fjords and frozen lands to shape the destiny of France and far more. So the next time you hear of William, of Rollo, of Hastings, do not only think of crowns and castles. Think of chromosomes and lineages. Think of how the blood of raiders became the blood of rulers, and how that blood still flows. For Normandy was not the end of the Viking story, it was a new chapter. A chapter where swords gave way to crowns, where raids gave way to rule, where genes carried forward long after ships turned to dust. That is the Norman echo. That is the surprise. That Viking DNA did not only survive, it thrived, embedding itself into France, into England, into Sicily, into the very heart of Europe. And from there, it spread further still, ensuring that the Vikings never truly vanished. They live on in the Normans, and the Normans live on in us. The rivers of Eastern Europe run like silver veins through forests and plains, winding endlessly until they touch the Black Sea, and along those waters another Viking story unfolded, one less sung in Western sagas but no less powerful. These were the Varangians, Norse adventurers who did not look west toward the British Isles or south toward France but eastward into the heart of Slavic lands. They followed rivers like the Dnieper, the Volga, and the Don, dragging their longboats over portages, trading, raiding, and eventually ruling. Their presence shaped the birth of Russia itself, their very name echoing in the word Rus, a word that would give its name to a vast nation. But how do we know their shadows still linger? Because DNA reveals what chronicles only hint at. In the blood of modern Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians, faint traces of Scandinavian ancestry persist, most visible in northern regions where the Varangians once settled. These genetic markers are not dominant, but they are distinct, reminders that Vikings were not only lords of the sea but masters of rivers, carving paths into the very heart of Eurasia. Imagine the scene, a longboat gliding along a misty river at dawn, its crew wary of ambush, its hull heavy with furs, amber, and slaves captured in raids. These were not simple raiders, they were traders, men who linked the forests of the north with the markets of Byzantium and Baghdad. And wherever they went, they left more than goods. They left blood. They left families. They left DNA that still flows today. Archaeology supports this story. In burial mounds near Novgorod and along the Fokhov River, researchers have uncovered Scandinavian-style weapons, ornaments, and even ship burials. Yet the bones within those graves tell an even deeper story when tested for DNA. Many of them are hybrids, the children of Norse fathers and Slavic mothers, proof of mingling and integration that gave rise to new peoples. These are the shadows of the Varangians, shadows written into genomes as much as into chronicles. And who were these men who became rulers of the East? They were adventurers, mercenaries, sometimes merciless raiders, but also bridge builders between worlds. When the primary chronicle of Kievan Rus recounts the invitation of the Varangians to rule, it describes Slavic tribes calling upon Rurik and his kin to bring order. Whether this is legend or fact, DNA confirms that Scandinavians were indeed present in these lands, mixing their blood with locals and planting dynasties that would shape medieval states. The Rurikid dynasty, which ruled Kievan Rus and later Muscovy for centuries, carried Viking ancestry through its founder, and though generations of intermarriage diluted it, the origins remained. What does this mean for modern people? It means that the vast populations of Eastern Europe may carry silent fragments of Norse heritage, fragments buried deep beneath layers of Slavic, Turkic, and other ancestries, but still detectable through genetic analysis. Studies of Y chromosomes in northern Russia show haplogroups that point toward Scandinavian origins, especially among populations near the old Viking trade routes. These are the ghost fingerprints of the Varangians, echoes that refuse to fade. And let us not forget the Varangian Guard, those fearsome Norse warriors who served as elite bodyguards to Byzantine emperors. Many of them came from Russia, from Kievan Rus, where their Viking forebears had settled. Imagine the genetic highway this created: Norse blood flowing into Slavic lands, carried south into Constantinople, mingling with Greeks, Armenians, and others. DNA shows traces of this movement, scattered fragments that science is only beginning to piece together. The Vikings in Russia were not isolated marauders. They were conduits of exchange. They brought silver coins from the Caliphate, silks from the East, and ideas that reshaped societies. And while goods and ideas fade, genes endure. Today, when geneticists trace haplogroups across Eurasia, they find faint Scandinavian threads woven into the tapestry of Slavic populations, threads that trace back to the age of the Varangians. Consider Novgorod, one of the great centers of medieval Rus. Its chronicles speak of Scandinavian leaders, and its graves contain artifacts unmistakably Norse. DNA confirms that these leaders and their descendants carried both Scandinavian and Slavic ancestry, embodying the fusion that built Rus. Over centuries, the Norse identity faded, absorbed into Slavic culture, but the DNA never vanished. It lingered, quiet but persistent, waiting for modern science to reveal its presence. This is why we speak of Viking shadows in Russia, because they are there but not always obvious, hidden behind centuries of cultural transformation. Yet shadows reveal themselves when the light of genetics shines on them. And the light shows us that the Rus were not purely Slavic nor purely Norse but a blend, a synthesis born of rivers and ambition. We must ask, what does it mean that the origins of Russia, a vast power of later centuries, are tied to Viking blood? It means that the Viking Age did not only shape Western Europe but also the East, that their legacy stretches as far as the steppes and the Black Sea. It means that when we speak of Viking DNA, we must include not only Iceland and England but also Kiev, Novgorod, and Smolensk. Imagine standing on the banks of the Dnieper today, watching the water flow southward toward the Black Sea, and knowing that 1,000 years ago, Norse traders rode these same waters, their sweat and blood mingling with the land, their descendants still living along the riverbanks. This continuity is profound. The Vikings became invisible here, their name absorbed into Rus, their sagas replaced by Slavic chronicles, yet their legacy survives in bones, in blood, in the helix of life itself. The shadows of the Varangians stretch long, reaching not only through Russia but also into the Byzantine Empire, into the Crusades, into the very veins of Europe's history. When a modern Russian carries a faint trace of Scandinavian DNA, they carry a fragment of that shadow. When a geneticist uncovers a haplogroup linked to Norsemen in a Ukrainian sample, they are touching the echo of longboats on forgotten rivers. This is not myth. This is science. And it tells us that the Vikings did not vanish when they sailed east. They endured, quietly, invisibly, leaving shadows that only genetics could reveal. So when we ask about Viking DNA today, let us not look only to the west, to the isles and the fjords. Let us also look east, to the forests, rivers, and plains of Russia, where Norse bloodlines mingled with Slavic hearts, creating something new, something lasting. That is the true story of Viking shadows in Russia. Not conquest alone, not settlement alone, but transformation. And those shadows, though faint, still move with us today, carried in the very lifeblood of millions. The North Atlantic is no gentle sea. It is a vast and merciless expanse, where storms rise like mountains and waves can swallow ships whole. Yet it was here that the Vikings carved one of their boldest legacies, a saga written not in parchment but in bloodlines, in settlements, and in the silent endurance of DNA. The Norse did not fear this ocean. They mastered it. Their longships were not mere raiding vessels but marvels of engineering, able to ride the swells and cut through the storm. With these ships they leapt westward, from Norway to the Faroes, from the Faroes to Iceland, from Iceland to Greenland, and even beyond to North America. Every leap was a gamble with death, yet every leap planted roots that still show in the veins of people today. Archaeology reveals the ruins of turf houses in Iceland, the remnants of farms in Greenland, and the faint traces of settlements in Newfoundland, but genetics tells us what ruins cannot. It tells us that the Norse did not only pass through these lands. They stayed, they mingled, they left themselves behind in ways that endure through centuries. Let us begin with the Faroes, those wind-swept islands where sheep graze on cliffs that plunge into roaring seas. Here Viking settlers arrived in the 9th century, bringing livestock, grain, and families. DNA studies of modern Faroese people show high levels of Scandinavian ancestry, but also genetic signals from the British Isles, evidence that Norse settlers often brought Celtic women with them from raids or migrations. These blended communities created a unique gene pool, one that still bears the mark of Viking daring. Move farther west to Iceland and the story grows richer. Iceland was a true frontier, a volcanic island where no human had lived before the Norse arrived. Here they created a society from nothing, building farms on lava fields, raising cattle in valleys, and writing sagas that would preserve their deeds for all time. Genetic studies confirm that the founding population of Iceland was heavily Scandinavian in its male lines, but surprisingly Celtic in its female lines, again showing that Viking men often traveled with women from the British Isles. The result is a population whose DNA still carries this mix, making Icelanders today a living archive of Viking expansion. And Iceland became more than a settlement. It became a hub, a place from which further voyages pushed westward. Greenland was the next great leap. Eric the Red, exiled from Iceland, led settlers to its frozen shores around 985. There they built farms, churches, and communities, clinging to survival in a land where ice ruled more than sun. 4 centuries they endured, trading walrus ivory with Europe and raising children whose blood carried the Norse legacy into one of the harshest environments on Earth. DNA from skeletal remains in Greenland reveals that these settlers were fully Scandinavian, but their disappearance around the 15th century has left scholars puzzled. Did they die out? Did they mingle with Inuit populations? Some genetic evidence hints at contact between Norse settlers and Inuit peoples, raising the possibility that fragments of Viking DNA may still linger in Greenlandic populations today. This question remains open, a haunting mystery carried in genes as much as in ruins. But the boldest leap of all was Vinland, the Norse name for North America. At Lance Aux Meadows in Newfoundland, archaeologists uncovered the remains of a Viking settlement, proving that around the year 1000, Norse explorers reached the New World. DNA evidence here is elusive, yet tantalizing hints suggest that interactions occurred between Norse settlers and indigenous peoples. Some genetic studies in Iceland even propose that small fragments of Native American DNA entered Icelandic lineages during the Viking Age, perhaps carried back by explorers who returned from Vinland. If this is true, then the Atlantic was not just a barrier but a bridge, and Viking bloodlines may have been among the very first to connect the Old World and the New. Think of what that means. It means that centuries before Columbus, human genes may have crossed the ocean in both directions, creating a legacy invisible until modern science revealed it. The Norse in the North Atlantic were not just raiders or settlers, They were pioneers at the very edge of the known world. And their legacy did not end when their colonies fell. It lived on in DNA, in sagas, in the resilience of people who trace their ancestry back to those storm-tossed voyages. Today, geneticists examining Iceland find one of the most well-documented Viking gene pools, a population shaped by isolation yet deeply connected to the wider Norse story. In the Faroes, DNA still tells the story of Viking men and Celtic women forging new communities. In Greenland, the question of mingling remains alive, a mystery science continues to probe. And in North America, the faint possibility of Viking DNA lingers like a shadow, reminding us that the first European presence there was not Spanish or English but Norse. We must ask, what drove them to risk so much? Why did they sail into the unknown when the seas offered only peril? The answer lies in both necessity and ambition. Scandinavian lands were harsh, population pressures pushed outward, and opportunity beckoned across the horizon. But deeper still, it was in their nature. The same resilience etched into their DNA, the same endurance that helped them survive in fjords and forests, drove them to conquer oceans. That trait survives today in their descendants, a fragment of wanderlust, a piece of restlessness coded into blood. When you meet an Icelander, a Faroese, or even a Canadian of Norse descent, you are meeting not just a person but a living echo of voyages that defied fear. The Atlantic is unforgiving, yet the Vikings made it their highway, and DNA proves they left passengers behind on every shore. So the next time you look across that endless ocean, remember the longships that once cut its surface, the men and women who braved its fury, and the children who carried their blood forward. Remember that the Atlantic was not empty. It was alive with Norse daring, alive with journeys that seeded genes as far as Newfoundland. That is why today, Viking DNA surprises us in places no saga could fully capture. It endures in the North Atlantic, in islands and coasts, in people who never knew they carried the courage of ocean voyagers in their veins. The Norse in the North Atlantic did not vanish. They became part of the living world, part of us, part of the global reach of Viking blood. And in every storm, in every wave, in every restless dream, their legacy still sails. Iceland rises from the sea like a black stone fortress, its cliffs carved by waves, its valleys split by rivers of fire and ice, and into this volcanic wilderness came the Vikings, bringing with them families, animals, and the determination to build a society on the very edge of the world. No one had lived there before them. No cities stood waiting, no tribes defended its shores, only seabirds, seals, and silence. And so the Norse carved their new beginning upon an untouched canvas, leaving behind not only farms and sagas but a genetic record that makes Iceland one of the most unique populations on Earth. Today scientists turn to Iceland as a living laboratory of Viking DNA, because here, more than anywhere else, the genetic story of the Norse has been preserved with remarkable clarity. Why is this so? Because Iceland was isolated. For over 1,000 years, its people lived far from the great migrations that reshaped the rest of Europe. Ships rarely came after the early centuries, war seldom reached its shores, and so the bloodlines of the original settlers remained remarkably intact. Geneticists examining modern Icelanders find a striking mix. The male lines overwhelmingly Scandinavian, the female lines heavily Celtic. This means that Viking men from Norway and Denmark sailed west and, along the way, brought women from Ireland and Scotland, whether through marriage, alliance, or capture. These women became the mothers of Iceland, carrying Celtic mitochondrial DNA that still defines the population today. Imagine those first years. Turf houses huddled against icy winds. Smoke rising from hearths where Norse men and Celtic women shared food, language, and children. Those children became Icelanders, a new people forged from two ancestries, bound together by survival in a land of extremes. And because they were few in number, every life mattered. Every birth carried forward a genetic legacy that would echo through the centuries with little interruption. This is why today Iceland's DNA is so valuable to science. When researchers map genomes here, They can trace lineages back over a millennium with astonishing precision. They can see which genes came from Scandinavia, which from the Celtic world, and how those genes spread through the small, isolated population. It is like reading a living saga, written not in words but in chromosomes. Consider the great Icelandic sagas themselves, those epic stories of warriors, farmers, and feuds. They preserve names and deeds of people who lived 1,000 years ago, and astonishingly, DNA sometimes confirms their truth. Some families in Iceland today can trace their ancestry back through both written saga and genetic evidence, linking the living directly to the heroes of old. Where else in the world can such continuity be found? This is what makes Iceland not just an island but a genetic time capsule. Yet isolation is both gift and curse. Because the population was small and closed, certain genetic disorders became more common, passed down through generations without fresh genetic diversity to dilute them. Diseases rare elsewhere appear in Iceland with higher frequency, and yet this too has become a powerful tool for science. Iceland's unique gene pool has allowed researchers to identify links between specific genes and diseases, knowledge that benefits all humanity. Once again, Viking DNA has shaped not just history but the future of medicine. But let us not forget the human story behind these scientific revelations. Each gene is not just a code, it is a memory of lives lived on the edge of survival. Think of the settlers who braved volcanic eruptions, who endured winters of darkness, who fished stormy seas to feed their children. Their resilience was etched into their blood, and that resilience still lives in Icelanders today. When scientists identify genetic markers linked to endurance in cold climates or resistance to famine, they are seeing the echo of those first generations who refused to yield to Iceland's harshness. And what of culture? It too reflects the genetic story. Old Norse words blended with Celtic influence, but the Norse tongue remained dominant, evolving into Icelandic, a language so little changed that modern Icelanders can still read the sagas in their original form. In this, language mirrors DNA, preserved, isolated, enduring. The people became a living bridge to the Viking Age, not only through words but through blood. We must ask, how does it feel to live as a modern Icelander knowing that your genome is one of the clearest reflections of the Viking past? Perhaps most do not think of it daily, but science makes it undeniable. Each Icelander carries within them the proof of voyages across seas, the union of Norse and Celtic, the survival of families who refuse to abandon this isolated island. It is a powerful inheritance, one that binds them to both Scandinavia and the British Isles, yet sets them apart as something wholly unique. And yet, Iceland is not a frozen museum. It is alive, its people connected to the modern world, its genetic insights helping global medicine, its culture thriving. But beneath every modern layer lies that ancient core, a population shaped more directly by the Viking Age than perhaps any other on Earth. When researchers at Decode Genetics map Iceland's genomes, they can even reconstruct parts of the DNA of people who lived centuries ago, effectively bringing Viking ancestors back to life in the data of science. What other land can claim such a legacy? Iceland's very isolation ensured that what was planted 1,000 years ago still blooms today in Bloodlines. And so we can say that Iceland is more than a land of volcanoes and glaciers, it is a living archive of Viking DNA. A place where the past has not been erased by endless waves of migration but preserved in the veins of its people. Think again of those first longships landing on black sand beaches, of Norse men guiding animals onto shore, of Celtic women stepping into an unknown world, and of children born into a society that would endure for centuries. Their genes became the foundation of a nation, and that foundation still stands, unbroken, unblurred, undeniable. So when we speak of Iceland's genetic island, we speak of a miracle of continuity. We speak of the power of DNA to preserve stories no saga could capture. We speak of the enduring reach of the Vikings, whose daring westward not only discovered land but created a people whose very existence is proof of Norse ambition and resilience. The island itself is like a stone set in the Atlantic, but the true treasure is not its rock or fire, it is the blood of its people, blood that carries the clearest signal of the Viking Age into our modern world. And in every heartbeat, in every strand of DNA, Iceland still sings the song of the settlers who made it their home. Greenland rises like a frozen giant from the sea, its cliffs of ice gleaming under the pale northern sun, its interior locked in endless glaciers, and into this forbidding land came the Vikings, daring to plant colonies on its fragile edge. The year was around 985 when Eric the Red, exiled from Iceland for manslaughter, sailed westward and found a new land. He named it Greenland, perhaps as promise, perhaps as lure, though green pastures were few and fleeting on its cold shores. Yet settlers came, hundreds of them, men, women, children, bringing cattle, sheep, goats, tools, and the stubborn will to survive. For centuries they endured, carving farms into fjords, raising churches of stone, and weaving lives in a land where ice always waited to reclaim what little warmth existed. Archaeologists uncover their remnants, turf walls, church foundations, tools buried in frozen soil, but DNA whispers the deeper story. The Norse settlers of Greenland were fully Scandinavian in their genetic profile, drawn from Iceland and Norway, carrying both Norse Y chromosomes and Celtic mitochondrial lines. But their isolation shaped them uniquely, forging communities that lived at the knife's edge of survival. Imagine children born in turf houses lit only by whale oil lamps, their mothers knitting wool from sheep barely surviving in thin pastures, their fathers risking stormy seas to hunt seals and walrus. These children carried the Viking genome into one of the harshest climates ever colonized by Europeans. Yet after 4 centuries, the Norse colonies vanished. Why? This is one of history's most haunting mysteries. Climate change played its hand, with the medieval warm period giving way to the Little Ice Age, choking pastures with frost and shortening growing seasons. Trade routes with Europe weakened, leaving Greenlanders cut off, unable to import iron or timber. Conflict with the Inuit, skilled hunters adapted to the Arctic, may have further strained survival. Yet even as their society faltered, DNA hints at something profound. Some studies suggest intermarriage between Norse settlers and Inuit communities, creating a faint but lasting genetic legacy in Greenland's modern Inuit population. In 2010, scientists identified fragments of European DNA in Inuit genomes that may trace back not to later colonial encounters but to Viking times. If true, then the Norse of Greenland did not vanish entirely. They lived on through blended descendants, their blood absorbed into the Arctic world they once tried to tame. Picture this, a Norse hunter, his farm ruined by frost, joining an Inuit band, marrying into their kin, and his children carrying both lineages into the frozen future. That possibility transforms the story from one of extinction to one of transformation. Yet even without such unions, the Greenland colonies left a genetic ripple. Modern Icelanders, when tested, show fragments of genetic diversity introduced through contact with Greenland, including hints of possible Native American DNA brought back by Greenlanders who voyaged further west. Could it be that the Greenland Norse were the bridge, carrying genes across the Atlantic centuries before Columbus? Some evidence suggests so. In one Icelandic lineage, researchers traced a Native American genetic marker back to around 1000 CE, perfectly aligned with the era of Norse voyages from Greenland to Vinland. If correct, this means that Viking DNA did not merely survive Greenland but crossed oceans, linking continents in ways no one imagined until science uncovered it. The Greenland colonies themselves tell us another truth. Viking DNA was not just about conquest but about endurance. These settlers clung to life in conditions that would break most people, adapting diets to include more fish and seal meat, shifting architecture to hold heat, and pushing their genetic resilience to its limits. Modern geneticists believe that certain adaptations to cold weather and fat metabolism seen in Scandinavian populations may have been tested to the extreme in Greenland, shaping survival through natural selection. And even when the colonies fell silent, when churches were abandoned and farms reclaimed by snow, their story lived on in DNA carried outward. Today, archaeologists recovering bones from Greenland's Norse graves analyze their genomes, comparing them with modern populations. The results reveal continuity with Iceland, Norway, and possibly faint echoes in Greenlandic Inuit, proof that the Norse presence did not vanish into nothing. It slipped into history, quieter, subtler, but not erased. Let us not forget the human faces behind these genetic shadows. A mother burying her child in frozen soil, her grief carried forward in mitochondrial DNA passed to her surviving children. A farmer struggling to keep cattle alive in icy winters, his Y chromosome carried forward by sons who may later have joined Inuit bands. A girl born in a turf house, her laughter lost to time but her genetic signature lingering in unexpected places. These are the stories DNA tells, stories the sagas never recorded, stories only blood remembers. Greenland's forgotten colonies remind us that disappearance is never absolute. Peoples may fade, cultures may crumble, but genes often persist, carried invisibly into new identities, waiting centuries to be revealed. When we speak of the Vikings' global reach, we must include this frozen chapter, for here they pushed farther into the Arctic than any Europeans before them. Here they tested the limits of endurance. Here they left genetic footprints in snow that does not melt. And though the ruins lie silent, their DNA still speaks. Scientists studying mitochondrial markers in Greenlandic Inuit find signals that suggest European contact earlier than expected. Scholars debate, but the possibility alone reveals how profound the Viking experiment in Greenland truly was. They were not simply exiles building farms, they were pioneers connecting worlds. The colonies may be forgotten in chronicles, but they are remembered in blood. That is the enduring paradox of Greenland. To the eye it seems a story of failure, of abandonment, of silence. But to DNA it is a story of persistence, of mingling, of legacy hidden beneath ice. And so when you gaze upon Greenland's icy fjords, do not think only of empty ruins. Think of the settlers who carried Viking DNA into this frozen edge. Think of the children who played on snowfields, their laughter vanishing into wind but their bloodlines surviving in ways unseen. Think of the possibility that their genes crossed oceans, linking Old World and New long before Columbus dreamed of sails. The Greenland colonies were not a dead end, they were a passage, a channel through which Viking DNA flowed further, wider, deeper into history. Forgotten by many, remembered by few, but written permanently into the genetic saga of humanity. The ocean stretches vast and unforgiving between Greenland and the unknown coasts of North America, yet the Vikings dared to cross it, centuries before Columbus ever dreamed of sails. Around the year 1000, Leif Erikson and his crew sailed westward, guided by stories of lands glimpsed by earlier voyagers, and found themselves on the shores of a new continent. They called it Vinland, a place of wild grapes, rich forests, and fertile ground, so different from the barren pastures of Greenland. Archaeologists discovered their presence at L'Anse aux Meadows in Newfoundland, a settlement of timber halls and workshops that spoke of a community intent on more than a fleeting raid. These settlers brought tools, iron nails, and livestock, proof that they intended permanence. And though the settlement was short-lived, its impact reached far beyond its ruins. For in this venture, Viking DNA may have crossed oceans, leaving traces not only in sagas but in the veins of people today. Imagine those first encounters. Norsemen standing on unfamiliar shores, facing indigenous peoples whose ancestors had lived there for thousands of years. We do not know the words exchanged, the gestures made, the fears or hopes that filled the air, but we know contact occurred. The sagas speak of skrælings, the Norse term for the natives, and tell of trade, tension, and conflict. Yet DNA suggests something deeper: connection. In 2010, scientists studying modern Icelandic genomes discovered a genetic marker of Native American origin present in a handful of families. The lineage traced back to around the year 1000, suggesting that it entered Iceland through contact with Greenlanders who may have voyaged to Vinland and returned with more than stories. Could it be that a Native American woman or child crossed the Atlantic with the Norse and became part of Iceland's population? If so, it would mean that genes traveled west to east across the Atlantic 5 centuries before Columbus, carried by Viking daring. This possibility transforms our understanding of history, for it reveals that the first biological bridge between Old World and New was not forged by caravels but by longships. The legacy of North America in the Viking saga is not just a failed settlement, it is a hidden thread in human genetics. Consider the significance of Lance aux Meadows. It was not a fortress of raiders but a base camp of explorers, with evidence of iron smelting, carpentry, and domestic life. This shows intent, ambition, and a vision of permanence. Though abandoned, the site proves that Vikings carried their culture, their families, and perhaps their bloodlines into the New World. Archaeologists continue to search for other sites, for sagas speak of Markland and Helluland, lands rich in timber and stone, possibly Labrador and Baffin Island. Each new discovery deepens the possibility that Norse presence in North America was broader than we know. And with each possibility comes the chance that DNA, quietly exchanged through unions with indigenous peoples, may still be detectable. The sagas tell us that conflict eventually ended the Vinland experiment. Skirmishes with natives, isolation from the Norse world, and the difficulty of sustaining colonies so far from Iceland and Greenland all conspired against permanence. Yet DNA has no regard for permanence. It records every union, every child born, no matter how fleeting the contact. That is why the faint signal of Native American ancestry in Icelandic lineages is so striking, because it means that even short-lived encounters can echo across 1,000 years. Picture a Viking child in Greenland with dark eyes inherited from an indigenous mother brought from Vinland. Picture the child's descendants sailing back to Iceland, blending into the population, their unique gene carried forward invisibly until modern science revealed it. That is the power of genetics. It brings to life stories lost to silence, proving that contact between continents was not just cultural but biological. And what of North America itself? Could Viking DNA linger among indigenous populations? The evidence is uncertain, but some genetic studies suggest faint European signals present before later colonial contact. These may be remnants of Norse unions, fragments of Viking blood hidden within the vast genetic diversity of Native American peoples. If true, then the Norse legacy in North America is not erased but absorbed, woven into the genetic fabric of the land. This possibility invites us to rethink what it means to settle. Even if the Norse left no lasting towns, their presence may still endure in bloodlines, which outlast wood, stone, and memory. Beyond genetics, the Viking venture into North America reshaped imagination. For centuries, sagas of Vinland circulated, speaking of a land beyond the sea. Though dismissed as legend for much of history, archaeology and genetics now confirm their truth. The Norse did not dream, they dared, and their daring left marks we can still see. Today, when scientists analyze genomes in Iceland, Greenland, and even parts of Canada, they continue to search for the faint echoes of this transatlantic contact. Each discovery brings us closer to confirming what the sagas whispered, that the Vikings reached America, lived there, met its peoples, and carried something of them back across the ocean. We must ask, what drove them across such terrifying waters? The answer is partly necessity. Greenland was harsh, and Vinland offered promise. But it was also curiosity, ambition, and the restless spirit that defined Viking DNA itself. That restlessness survives today in their descendants, a trait coded into blood as much as into culture. When modern Icelanders carry a Native American genetic marker, they are not only living proof of Viking voyages, they are living bridges between two worlds, embodying a connection made long before history recorded it. And when modern science uncovers this truth, it reminds us that history is not only written in books but in bodies. The Viking legacy in North America is not a tale of failure but of continuity. The settlement at Lance aux Meadows may have fallen silent, but the genes carried back across the sea still speak. The sagas may have exaggerated, but DNA does not lie. It tells us that Vikings crossed oceans, that they mingled, that they changed the human story in ways forgotten until now. So when we stand on the coast of Newfoundland and gaze out over gray waters, we must imagine the longships arriving 1,000 years ago, their sails full of icy wind, their crews stepping onto new soil, carrying both Norse blood and the potential for new bloodlines. We must imagine that though their walls crumbled, though their farms failed, their genes did not vanish. They traveled back, they endured, they surprised us by reappearing in modern genomes. That is the Viking legacy in North America. Not ruins alone, but blood still flowing. Not a failed colony, but a lasting link. Not silence, but echoes written into DNA. And through those echoes, the Vikings still sail. The walls of Constantinople glistened in the sun like the gates of heaven, its domes rising above the Bosporus, its streets alive with merchants from every corner of the world, and into this magnificent empire came the Vikings, not as conquerors, but as warriors for hire. These were the Varangians, Norsemen who traveled down the rivers of Russia, through Kiev and Novgorod, carrying their swords southward until they reached the heart of Byzantium. The emperors of the Eastern Roman Empire, wary of betrayal from local troops, sought men whose loyalty lay only in their pay. And so they recruited the fiercest fighters of the north, men who became the Varangian Guard, the personal protectors of emperors, wielders of axes so massive that they split shields and skulls in a single blow. Imagine the sight: tall men with fair hair and piercing eyes, clad in chain mail, standing like living walls around the emperor as he paraded through the hippodrome. To the citizens of Constantinople they were exotic, terrifying, and admired. But what did this mean for DNA? It meant that Viking bloodlines, carried by these mercenaries, entered the very crossroads of the medieval world. Constantinople was not just a city, it was a hub where Europe met Asia, where traders from Persia, Arabia, Africa, and the steppes mingled. When Varangians served here, they did not live in barracks alone. They lived in the city, they married local women, they fathered children who carried Norse blood into Greek, Armenian, and Anatolian families. Genetic studies hint at this mingling. Certain haplogroups found in southern Europe and Anatolia show faint but traceable links to Scandinavian origins, likely introduced during this period of Varangian presence. While not overwhelming, these markers reveal that Viking DNA seeped quietly into the great melting pot of Byzantium. Consider the symbolic power of this. The same men who once raided monasteries in England now defended the richest Christian city in the world. The same axes that cut through Anglo-Saxon shields now stood guard before the emperor's throne. And in that transformation, Viking genes traveled farther than longships alone could carry them. Chronicles record famous moments when the Varangians proved their worth. At the Battle of Beroia in 1122, the Guard fought with such ferocity that even hardened enemies feared their axes. In ceremonies, they were granted the honor of guarding the emperor's treasury and even his bedchamber. Their loyalty became legendary, and with loyalty came reward, land, gold, and marriages into Byzantine society. Each union left traces, children whose features carried the blend of Norse strength and Mediterranean grace. These children grew up far from fjords, their blue eyes glancing over mosaics instead of mountains, their Viking blood diluted yet enduring. And because Byzantium was a cosmopolitan empire, these children's descendants spread further still, marrying into Armenian, Georgian, and Levantine families. DNA followed silently, carried in veins that moved across trade routes from Constantinople to Cairo, from Antioch to Jerusalem. In this way, Viking genetics became part of the very bloodstream of the Mediterranean world. Archaeological finds add weight to this vision. Norse-style runes carved into marble in Hagia Sophia testify that the Varangians were truly present. Graves in the Black Sea region, containing both Scandinavian artifacts and Byzantine influences, suggest mingling. And when skeletons from these regions are tested, faint northern markers appear, telling us that the Varangian presence was not only cultural but biological. The saga of Harald Hardrada illustrates this blending vividly. Before he became king of Norway, Harald served in the Varangian Guard, fighting in Sicily, Jerusalem, and Anatolia. He carried back not only wealth but experiences, and perhaps children, left behind in lands far from Norway. If even kings mingled, how much more likely were ordinary soldiers to leave bloodlines scattered across the empire? We must ask, what does this mean for modern populations? It means that in Greece, in Turkey, in Armenia, faint signals of Viking ancestry may survive. Not enough to dominate, but enough to surprise, enough to remind us that the reach of Norse genetics was wider than sagas imagined. When geneticists trace unusual northern haplogroups in southern lands, they sometimes whisper of this very history. It also means that Viking DNA did not remain confined to the cold north but entered the warm south, blending with ancient lineages of Rome and Byzantium. This mingling was not conquest but service, not empire building but empire protecting, and yet its legacy is as real as any conquest. Imagine a Byzantine merchant's daughter marrying a Varangian guard, their child growing up under the domes of Constantinople, learning Greek prayers yet carrying a Norse Y chromosome. That child's descendants may today live anywhere from Athens to Beirut, unaware that their lineage includes warriors from the farthest north. This is how Viking DNA traveled invisibly, not only by raids and settlements but by the quiet unions of mercenaries and locals. The Varangian Guard was more than an elite corps. It was a channel through which Norse blood entered the Mediterranean world. Over centuries, as Byzantium faltered and eventually fell, these lineages remained, absorbed into the larger populations, indistinguishable but real. DNA remembers when chronicles forget. And so the story of the Vikings in Byzantium is not just one of axes and emperors, but one of children, of families, of genes slipping into the cosmopolitan swirl of the medieval world. We often imagine the Viking Age as ending when the last raid ceased, but DNA proves otherwise. It endured wherever Vikings went, and in Byzantium they went farther than most. Here they became more than warriors, they became part of the city itself, guardians of its glory, contributors to its bloodlines. And when Constantinople fell in 1453, those bloodlines did not vanish. They flowed into Ottoman populations, into Balkan families, into the veins of countless descendants who carry Viking DNA without knowing it. This is the paradox of history. The fiercest Norse raiders became the most loyal protectors of emperors. Their axes became symbols of service, their genes became threads in a southern tapestry. And today, science allows us to see those threads, faint but present, reminding us that the reach of Viking DNA stretched from Arctic fjords to Byzantine palaces. That is the true legacy of the Varangians in Byzantium. Not only warriors in sagas, not only names in chronicles, but living echoes in the blood of people across the Mediterranean. They remind us that history is not lines on a map, but flows of blood, currents of DNA that cross borders, merge, and endure. And in every Byzantine mosaic, in every stone that still stands in Istanbul, we can imagine the tall shadows of the Varangian Guard, and know that their legacy did not end with their service. It continues, silently, in bloodlines that still walk among us. The Middle East has always been the meeting ground of civilizations, a crossroads where caravans and fleets carried silks, spices, and silver, and into this ancient landscape came the Vikings, following rivers, seas, and trade routes that stretched farther than any saga dared to imagine. From the Baltic, they sailed the rivers of Russia, passing through Kiev, Novgorod, and down to the Black Sea, until they reached the riches of the Abbasid Caliphate. Arab chroniclers called them the Rus, describing tall men with fair hair, armed with axes, who brought furs and slaves to the markets of Baghdad. The Vikings came as traders, but they also came as warriors, mercenaries willing to fight for pay in lands of scorching heat far from their frozen fjords. What does DNA tell us of these journeys? It tells us that Norse genes did not stop at the gates of Byzantium. They pushed farther, carried by men who fathered children in lands stretching from Anatolia to Persia. Genetic studies of populations in Iran and the Caucasus reveal faint Scandinavian markers, traces that suggest contact and mingling during the height of these trade networks. How astonishing is it to imagine Viking DNA hidden in the bloodlines of merchants in Shiraz, warriors in Tabriz, or sailors in Basra. Yet the evidence whispers that it is so. Silver coins from the Abbasid Caliphate, minted in Baghdad, have been found in huge numbers in Sweden, buried in hoards that testify to a trade route stretching thousands of miles. For every coin that traveled north, some Norse blood traveled south. Arab historians such as Ibn Fadlan wrote vivid accounts of these Norse traders, describing their appearance, their customs, even their funerary rites. He called them filthy, yet also admired their strength, their bravery, their strange rituals. In his records we see Vikings not as distant legends but as living men on the banks of the Volga, preparing their dead with ship burials beneath the wide Asian sky. And if they were there, mingling with merchants, soldiers, and slaves, then their genes too must have lingered, passed down through unions unrecorded by chronicles. Imagine a Norse warrior taking a local bride in a caravan town, their children raised in Muslim households, their Viking ancestry hidden beneath Arabic names and prayers. Those children's descendants might still walk today in the markets of Baghdad or Damascus, unaware that a fragment of their DNA comes from longships that once cut through Baltic waters. This is the hidden story of Viking footprints in the Middle East. Not only weapons but bloodlines. Not only trade goods but genes. Archaeology strengthens the tale. Graves in Russia contain silver coins from Samarkand, silks from Persia, and beads from the Islamic world, proof that Vikings traveled deep into trade networks linking the Mediterranean and Asia. Some skeletons found in Volga regions show genetic markers blending Norse and steppe ancestry, suggesting that unions along these trade routes were common. The Norse were not isolated. They were part of a vast human web stretching from Scandinavia to Baghdad, from Constantinople to Bokhara. And DNA carries this web into the present. Consider too the Varangians who joined the Byzantine Guard. Many of them traveled further still, serving in campaigns that reached Syria, Palestine, and even Egypt. Here again, their presence opened doors to unions, to children who carried Norse chromosomes into Middle Eastern lineages. And because the Byzantine Empire and the Abbasid Caliphate interacted constantly, through war, trade, diplomacy, and intermarriage, the Varangian presence in Byzantium indirectly carried Viking genes into the broader Middle Eastern world. We must ask, how did Viking blood endure in these lands? The answer is simple: through quiet assimilation. Norse traders and warriors did not form empires here. They did not conquer cities. Instead, they slipped into existing societies, becoming husbands, fathers, and neighbors, their identity lost but their genes preserved. And science today, testing mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome haplogroups, finds occasional anomalies, northern signatures where none should exist. These are the shadows of the Vikings, still walking in Middle Eastern veins. Consider the Abbasid court in Baghdad, glittering with scholars, poets, and merchants. Among the throng of traders might stand a tall, blonde-haired Norseman bargaining for silver, his accent strange, his presence exotic. If he remained, if he took a wife, if he fathered children, then his descendants became part of Baghdad itself, indistinguishable yet marked forever by a foreign inheritance. How many such stories unfolded, unnoticed, unrecorded, yet preserved in blood? Think also of the slave trade. Many of the people the Vikings sold into Middle Eastern markets were Slavs and Finns, yet some Vikings themselves may have been captured, enslaved, and absorbed into Muslim societies. In such cases, Viking DNA entered the Middle East not by choice but by force, carried through generations until it became part of the diverse genetic mosaic of the region. This too is a footprint, a genetic scar left by history's brutal commerce. And then there are the legends. In some Middle Eastern tales, tall fair warriors are remembered as mercenaries in distant campaigns, their origins vague but their presence unforgettable. Could these be echoes of Varangians, of Vikings who left their mark in story as well as in blood? Perhaps. What matters is that science confirms the possibility, showing that Viking DNA did not remain confined to Europe but touched the lands of Islam, of Persia, of the Levant. This is a revelation, for it tells us that the Viking Age was not merely northern but global, its reach extending into deserts and bazaars, into mosques and caravanserais, into the very veins of peoples far from fjords and sagas. And when we look at Middle Eastern populations today, with their deep and ancient lineages, we may find within them faint northern threads, reminders of longships that once dared the rivers of Russia and the markets of Baghdad. These threads are subtle, almost invisible, but they exist, waiting for careful study to bring them fully to light. And when they are revealed, they expand our understanding of what Viking legacy means. It is not only castles in England or farms in Iceland. It is also children born in caravan towns, warriors buried on Asian steppes, families absorbed into Muslim households. That is why Viking DNA surprises us. It appears where we least expect it, in places no saga recorded, in lands where no rune stones stand, in bloodlines that carried their memory unknowingly through centuries. So when we ask whether the Vikings reached the Middle East, the answer is not only yes in trade and war, but yes in blood. They left footprints not only in coins and chronicles, but in DNA, footprints that still walk in the living today. And through those footprints, the Vikings remind us that their story was always larger than Europe, always broader than the sagas told. It was a story of global reach, of genes carried farther than longships alone, of humanity mingling in ways that only blood can record. And in the Middle East, where so many civilizations met, the Vikings too became part of the human tapestry, their legacy hidden yet enduring, their DNA a quiet testament that even in deserts, the Northmen left their mark. Sicily stands at the heart of the Mediterranean like a jewel of fire and stone, its mountains crowned with castles, its shores washed by waves that once carried Phoenicians, Greeks, Romans, Arabs, and Normans, and into this layered land came the legacy of the Vikings. The Norse did not arrive directly from Scandinavia with longships, but through their descendants, the Normans, whose blood still carried the pulse of the fjords. These were men forged in France, shaped by Frankish culture yet bearing the DNA of Viking settlers who had carved out Normandy generations earlier. In the 11th century, these Normans turned their eyes southward, drawn by opportunity in the fractured lands of Italy. They came first as mercenaries, hired swords fighting for Lombard dukes and Byzantine rulers against Arab emirs who controlled much of Sicily. But mercenaries soon became masters. Under leaders like Robert Guiscard and his brother Roger, the Normans seized Calabria, Apulia, and eventually Sicily itself. And what does DNA tell us of this conquest? It tells us that the Viking touch extended far beyond France, that Norse bloodlines flowed into southern Italy, mingling with Greeks, Arabs, Lombards, and Sicilians. Modern genetic studies in Sicily reveal faint northern signatures, haplogroups linked to Scandinavia, layered atop the deep and ancient Mediterranean genome. These markers are subtle but undeniable, reminders that Viking heritage slipped into even the warmest corners of Europe. Imagine Palermo in the 12th century, the capital of Norman Sicily, its streets alive with markets where Arabic, Greek, Latin, and Norse tongues could all be heard. Here, beneath golden mosaics, Viking bloodlines lived on through Norman rulers who married local women, fathered children, and created dynasties that fused northern and southern worlds. King Roger II, grandson of a Viking, presided over a court where Muslim scholars, Greek artists, and Latin priests worked side by side, creating one of the most cosmopolitan societies of the medieval age. His DNA carried the echo of Scandinavia, yet his kingdom stood at the crossroads of Africa and Europe. This is the Viking touch on Sicily, not only conquest but transformation, not only power but fusion. Archaeology reveals the same truth. Castles built by Normans rise across Sicily, but within them inscriptions in Arabic and mosaics in Byzantine style remind us that this was no simple northern takeover, it was a blending of cultures. And into this blend came blood. Norse chromosomes entered Sicilian families, diluted over centuries but still detectable in the genetic diversity of the island. Consider the soldiers who settled after campaigns, marrying local women and raising children who bore both Viking resilience and Mediterranean vitality. Their descendants spread across villages, their Norse heritage hidden beneath Italian names but alive in DNA. Some studies suggest that haplogroup I1, a marker strongly associated with Northern Europe, appears in southern Italy at levels higher than expected, likely introduced through Norman settlers. These genetic fingerprints are faint, yet they whisper of Viking ancestry in a land of citrus groves and olive trees. And what of culture's reflection of blood? Norman kings adopted Arab administration, Byzantine art, and Latin faith, yet they ruled with northern ferocity, their courts protected by warriors whose ancestors once sailed from fjords. The blending of genes mirrored the blending of traditions, creating a society unique in its diversity. DNA becomes the silent record of this experiment, proving that beneath every mosaic and inscription lay the living fusion of peoples. We must ask, what did it mean for Sicilians to inherit Viking DNA? It meant resilience, adaptability, and a reminder that even the farthest north could shape the farthest south. It meant that the legacy of longships reached into lands where lemons grew under endless sun, where volcanoes rumbled instead of glaciers, where Norse bloodlines became Mediterranean. And this legacy did not remain only in Sicily. From their base here, Norman warriors joined crusades, carrying their Viking heritage into the Holy Land, mingling again with Levantine populations. Every campaign scattered genes like seeds, leaving fragments of Viking ancestry across regions as distant as Antioch and Jerusalem. The story of Sicily, then, is part of a wider web of Viking influence, a chapter where northern bloodlines fused with Arab, Greek, and Latin, creating something entirely new. Imagine standing in the Palatine Chapel of Palermo, its ceiling carved in Arabic muqarnas, its walls covered in Byzantine mosaics, its altar dedicated to Latin rites, and knowing that the man who ordered it built carried Viking DNA. That is the paradox and the wonder of history, that a grandson of raiders who once terrorized Europe created one of the most sophisticated courts in the Mediterranean. And through his children, his bloodlines mingled with countless Sicilians, embedding Norse ancestry into the island's veins. Even today, when geneticists analyze Sicilian DNA, they sometimes uncover anomalies, northern markers that make sense only when we remember the Viking touch of the Normans. And those markers remind us that history is never erased. It is absorbed, transformed, and carried forward in flesh. Sicily is often called a mosaic of civilizations, but it is also a mosaic of genes, and within that mosaic a few tiles gleam with the pale light of the north. Those tiles may be few, but they are precious, proof that Viking DNA did not stop at the Alps, did not end in France, but flowed into the very heart of the Mediterranean. So when we speak of the Viking touch on Sicily, we are speaking of a genetic caress as much as a political conquest. We are speaking of blood that traveled from fjords to vineyards, from icy seas to sunlit shores, from raiders to kings. And that blood still flows, silently, in Sicilians who may never know their link to the north. This is why Viking DNA surprises us. It appears where the sagas are silent, where chronicles speak of Normans but forget their deeper roots, where ruins whisper of rulers but say nothing of chromosomes. Yet science listens, science reveals, science confirms that the Vikings touched Sicily not only with swords but with genes. And through those genes, they remain, a hidden northern shadow beneath the Mediterranean sun. Ireland, with its rolling green hills, mist-draped valleys, and stone-ringed fields, might seem far removed from the fjords of Norway or the windswept coasts of Denmark, yet here the Vikings left one of their most enduring legacies. The Norse first arrived in Ireland as raiders in the late 8th century, their longships slicing into bays and rivers, their warriors striking monasteries at places like Lambay Island and Armagh. To monks who recorded these attacks in trembling Latin, the Norse seemed like demons, fierce shadows from the sea bringing fire and blood. But history, as always, is more complex than terror alone. For the Vikings did not vanish after their raids. They returned, they built, they settled, and they mingled, leaving behind a genetic imprint that modern science has only recently begun to unravel. The greatest evidence of their presence lies in Dublin, a city founded by Vikings in 841, a base that began as a long fort, a fortified camp for raiders, and grew into a thriving hub of trade, power, and family life. Imagine the Dublin of the 10th century. Longships pulled onto riverbanks, markets filled with silver from the east, furs from the north, and slaves taken in raids across Ireland and Britain. Norse words mingled with Gaelic in the air, while children born of mixed unions played in narrow streets. Today, geneticists examining Irish DNA find clear traces of Scandinavian ancestry, especially in the east of the island where Viking settlements flourished. Studies reveal that up to 20% of men in certain regions carry Y chromosome markers linked to Norse origins, a startling reminder that raiders became fathers, and fathers became ancestors whose blood still flows. Consider the surnames that survive. Doyle, derived from Dubhale, meaning dark foreigner, often referred to Vikings. MacAuliffe, O'Loughlin, and others trace lines back to Norse settlers who integrated into Gaelic clans. Each name is not just a word but a genetic breadcrumb, leading back to longships and sagas. Archaeological finds confirm this blending. Graves around Dublin, Waterford, and Limerick reveal artifacts of both Norse and Gaelic origin, swords buried beside brooches, ship nails alongside Irish ornaments. And when bones from these graves are tested, they show a mixture of Norse and Irish DNA, proof that the Viking presence was not an invasion alone but an integration. What does this mean for modern Irish identity? It means that beneath the Gaelic poetry, beneath the Celtic myths, runs a current of Norse resilience. It means that Ireland's past is not a tale of pure isolation but one of fusion, where Vikings became part of the island's genetic and cultural landscape. The sagas speak of Norse kings in Dublin, such as Sihtric Silkbeard, who ruled for decades, minted coins, and sponsored churches. His descendants married into Irish dynasties, blending Norse and Gaelic blood at the highest levels of society. And those unions, repeated across generations, seeded Viking DNA throughout the island. Imagine an Irish child born in the 10th century with a Gaelic mother and a Norse father, raised speaking two tongues, carrying two traditions. That child's descendants might today bear no memory of their Viking ancestor, yet their DNA would still carry fragments of Scandinavia. This is how history hides itself, through silence in chronicles but survival in blood. Even in rural areas, far from cities, Norse influence spread. Farmers who once cursed raiders later traded with them, intermarried, and absorbed them into local communities. Genetic evidence shows Scandinavian markers appearing even in regions where written history makes no mention of Viking settlement. This suggests that Norse bloodlines traveled farther inland than expected, carried by families who left the coast for safer, fertile lands. And what of the cultural echoes that mirror genetic ones? Words like hag, sky, and egg entered Irish through Norse tongues. Decorative styles in jewelry and weapons show blending of Gaelic and Viking motifs. But while culture can fade, DNA remains, stubborn and precise, recording every union in silent code. Modern science has mapped these codes with astonishing clarity. In 2018, a large-scale genetic study of the Irish population confirmed higher-than-expected levels of Scandinavian ancestry, especially concentrated in Dublin and coastal towns, but also spread inland. This finding shocked many, for it proved that Viking presence was not fleeting but deeply formative. It also explained why some genetic traits more common in Scandinavia, such as certain immune system markers and height-related genes, appear at higher levels in parts of Ireland. The Vikings not only reshaped cities but reshaped bodies, leaving their stamp in physiology as well as in culture. We must ask, how should we see the Viking in Irish history? Not only as raider, not only as terror, but as ancestor. Without them, Dublin might never have become the powerful city it is today. Without them, many Irish families would lack entire branches of their heritage. Without them, the Irish genome itself would look different. This is not to glorify violence or forget suffering, but to acknowledge truth, that the Vikings became part of Ireland, absorbed into its people, their blood inseparable from the Gaelic stream. And this legacy travels beyond the island. When Irish migrants carried their genes to America, Australia, and beyond, they also carried Viking DNA, spreading it far wider than the longships themselves once reached. Thus, the Viking story in Ireland is not only local but global. It lives in Irish diaspora populations worldwide, where Norse markers appear alongside Gaelic and Anglo roots. Picture a man in Boston or Sydney, proud of his Irish ancestry, unaware that within him lies also the blood of Vikings who once raided monasteries and built Dublin. That is the hidden surprise of genetics. It shows us truths our surnames and stories forgot. Archaeology continues to uncover this legacy. Excavations in Dublin reveal layers of Norse settlement beneath modern streets, artifacts that belong to families whose descendants walk among us. Bones unearthed in Waterford show mixed diets of Scandinavian and Irish foods, a fusion of cultures mirrored in DNA. And each discovery reinforces what science already proves, that the Norse are not just a chapter in Ireland's history but a thread in its very fabric. So when we speak of Norse DNA in Ireland's past, we speak not of ghosts but of living inheritance. We speak of children born from raids turned into marriages, of families forged from fear turned into kinship, of genes that traveled across seas and found a permanent home in green valleys. And today, every time an Irish heart beats, there is a chance that it carries within it a spark from the north, a whisper of fjords, a fragment of longship daring. The Vikings are still here, not as enemies but as ancestors. And in Ireland, perhaps more than anywhere else, their legacy endures, woven into the blood of a people who once fought them, then married them, and finally became them. Scotland, with its jagged cliffs, stormy seas, and wind-swept highlands, stood as both target and refuge for the Norse, and nowhere did their presence sink deeper than in the Orkney and Shetland Islands. Here the Vikings were not merely raiders but settlers, lords, and farmers, carving their marks so deeply that modern DNA still glows with their presence. Archaeologists tell us that Norse longships first appeared off the Scottish coast in the late 8th century, their dragon heads cutting through mist, their warriors striking monasteries at Lindisfarne and Iona. To Gaelic monks they were demons, but to science today they are ancestors. Genetic studies show that up to 25% of male lineages in Orkney and Shetland are Scandinavian in origin, a staggering figure that proves just how firmly the Norse rooted themselves. These were not fleeting raids but permanent colonies. Imagine the islands around 900 CE, longhouses clustered near bays, smoke rising from turf roofs, sheep grazing on cliffs, Norse farmers plowing soil beside Pictish neighbors. Intermarriage followed, blending bloodlines, creating communities where Norse DNA became dominant over time. The Orkney saga records tales of jarls who ruled the islands as Norse earldoms, yet the true saga lies not only in texts but in the helix of living islanders whose ancestry still leans north. Even surnames today, Sinclair, Gunn, Macaulay, echo with Norse roots, each a linguistic fossil pointing to Viking fathers and Scottish mothers. But DNA reveals what names alone cannot. It shows that while Norse men were the majority of settlers, Norse women also came, their mitochondrial lines joining Celtic ones, proving that whole families crossed the sea, not just warriors. This is crucial, for it explains why Orkney and Shetland carry such high levels of Viking ancestry compared to mainland Scotland. Entire communities relocated, bringing culture, genes, and resilience to a new homeland. Consider Kirkwall, the heart of Orkney, where St. Magnus Cathedral still rises, built by Norse earls. Beneath its stones lie graves of men and women whose DNA binds modern Arcadians to Norway. When skeletons from these burials are sequenced, the results reveal unmistakable Scandinavian haplogroups, proof that the cathedral was not only spiritual but genetic monument. Move to Shetland and the story is the same. Here genetic surveys show Norse ancestry at levels approaching 40%, higher than almost anywhere outside Scandinavia. Shetlanders today, when tested, often carry markers more common in Norway than in mainland Britain, a living testament that Vikings did not only visit, they became the people of the islands. But the story stretches beyond islands. On the Scottish mainland, in Caithness and the Hebrides, Norse ancestry also appears, though diluted by centuries of blending with Gaelic clans. Surnames like MacLeod and McCaskill trace directly back to Norse origins, their DNA confirming what tradition has long claimed. Even in Highland glens, far from coasts, genetic studies find faint Scandinavian threads woven into the fabric of Scottish identity. This reveals a truth often overlooked. that Viking presence was not confined to shores but penetrated inland, carried by families who moved from island to mainland, marrying into Gaelic lineages. And what of culture? Here, too, the Norse legacy mirrors the genetic one. Place names across Orkney and Shetland end in "I" from the Old Norse word for island, while terms like "bairn" and "kirk" entered Scots language from Norse tongues. These linguistic traces align with DNA, showing that the Vikings did not vanish but transformed, their genes and words absorbed into Scottish life. Yet the DNA tells us even more. It shows that in Orkney, Norse male lines often replaced earlier Pictish ones, a genetic turnover suggesting that Viking settlers became dominant in leadership and reproduction. But it also shows continuity. Pictish maternal lines remained, blending with Norse paternal lines to create a hybrid community. This is not extermination but fusion, the creation of something new. Arcadians, neither fully Norse nor fully Pictish, but both. We must ask, what does it mean for modern Scots to carry Viking DNA? It means that the fierce independence, the maritime skill, the resilience of the North lives on in their veins. It means that history's divisions between Norse and Gael blur in blood, creating unity where chronicles recorded conflict. It means that the Jarls of Orkney are not only figures in sagas but grandfathers of living islanders. And this legacy travels beyond Scotland. When Scots migrated in later centuries to Canada, America, and Australia, they carried with them their Norse DNA, spreading it once again across oceans. Thus, the Viking roots in Scotland did not stay bound to those islands. They became global, carried by descendants who often never knew their link to Norway. Consider also the genetic evidence of adaptation. Some traits common in Scandinavia, such as height, lactose tolerance, and certain immune markers, appear at higher frequency in Orkney and Shetland, suggesting that Norse genes influenced not only ancestry but health and physiology of these populations. This scientific detail brings the saga closer, showing that Viking resilience is not only cultural memory but biological inheritance. Archaeology adds flesh to this picture. Excavations at Bursey and Jarlshof reveal Norse-style longhouses, farms, and tools, confirming the scale of settlement. The bones recovered there, when sequenced, reveal hybrid ancestries, the literal blending of Norse and local peoples. This proves that the Viking presence was not one-sided but communal, shaping both genetics and daily life. And the echoes continue into the present. Festivals in Orkney still celebrate Norse heritage, but science adds depth to these traditions, proving that celebration is not just symbolic, it is ancestral. The blood of those who sailed from fjords still flows in island veins. That is why modern Arcadians and Shetlanders often feel a strong sense of distinct identity, different from mainland Scots. Their DNA confirms that difference, anchoring them to Norway as much as to Edinburgh. Yet we must not mistake this for isolation. Over centuries, these Norse-Scottish communities blended into broader Scotland, their genes absorbed into Highland clans, into lowland towns, into diaspora populations abroad. The result is that Viking DNA, seeded in Orkney and Shetland, now circulates worldwide. That is the true reach of their legacy, beginning in small island settlements, spreading through Scotland, carried abroad, and reappearing in unexpected places. So when we speak of Viking roots in Scotland and Orkney, we are not speaking of ruins or sagas alone. We are speaking of living blood, of people today who unknowingly carry the story of longships in their very cells. We are speaking of farmers in Orkney whose ancestors once ruled as Jarls, of Shetlanders whose DNA still leans northward, of Scots across the globe who carry Norse fragments alongside Gaelic pride. This is the Viking legacy, not frozen in history, but alive in veins, alive in hearts, alive in every storm that batters those islands where it all began. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, stand along the eastern shores of the sea that once carried Viking longships like restless shadows across the waves, and in these lands the Norse left a quieter but enduring legacy, one written not only in chronicles and runestones but in DNA. The Vikings saw the Baltic not as a boundary but as a highway, a gateway into the rivers that led to Russia, Byzantium, and the Islamic world. Their ships glided across its waters, trading, raiding, and settling, touching every coast, every harbor, every village brave enough to stand at the edge of their reach. Archaeological finds tell of their presence: silver hoards buried in Estonian soil, weapons of Scandinavian style unearthed in Latvian graves, amber from Baltic coasts carried back to Scandinavia in exchange for furs and iron. But what does DNA reveal? It reveals that the Baltic was not merely a crossroads of goods but of genes. Genetic studies of modern Estonian and Latvian populations show a faint yet distinct Scandinavian signal, most visible in Y chromosome haplogroups associated with Norse ancestry. These traces suggest that Viking men left descendants here, mingling with Finno-Ugric and Baltic tribes, embedding fragments of their blood into the populations of the region. Imagine a Norse trader setting up camp near the Daugava River, taking a local woman as wife, raising children who spoke both Norse and Baltic tongues, children whose genes would ripple through generations. Today, those ripples still move, subtle but real, detectable in genetic maps that reveal the Norse footprint. In Estonia, the evidence is particularly striking. The island of Saaremaa, where in 750 CE a fleet of Viking ships was buried along with their warriors, remains a genetic hotspot, its ancient DNA revealing Scandinavian haplogroups. These burials, filled with weapons, tools, and human remains, are among the earliest signs of Viking expansion, and the bones themselves show links to both local and Scandinavian ancestry. This proves that from the very beginning, the Baltic was a place of mixing, not of isolation. The Vikings did not remain apart; they merged, their DNA flowing into Baltic bloodlines as naturally as rivers flowing into the sea. Latvia tells a similar story. Excavations near Grobina reveal a major Viking settlement dating to the 7th and 8th centuries, with Scandinavian-style graves and artifacts. Modern Latvians still carry faint echoes of Norse ancestry, a reminder that these settlers did not vanish but became part of the population. The blending of Norse and Baltic was not only genetic but cultural, as local traditions absorbed Norse influences in art, trade, and even burial practices. And what of Lithuania? Though less directly touched by Viking settlement, its people too show traces of northern haplogroups, likely introduced through trade, intermarriage, and the constant movement of peoples across the Baltic corridor. The Vikings may not have founded towns here as they did in Dublin or York, but they touched the land nonetheless, leaving children whose genes flowed onward into the broader Lithuanian pool. We must ask, why is this legacy often overlooked? Perhaps because the Baltic tribes themselves were fierce, known for resisting outside domination, remembered for their endurance against later crusaders. Viking presence here was not conquest on a grand scale but influence through trade, settlement, and kinship. But DNA reveals that even small presences can have lasting effects. Every child born of a Norse father and a Baltic mother became a bridge between worlds, a carrier of genes that outlasted raids and alliances. And these bridges multiplied, quietly, until their legacy became measurable in modern populations. Consider also the broader picture. The Vikings who traveled east into Russia often passed through Baltic lands, recruiting locals, taking slaves, forming alliances. In this way, Norse DNA entered the region not only through direct settlement but through the constant movement of peoples along these trade routes. Some Estonian warriors even joined Norse expeditions, carrying their own genes into Scandinavia while receiving Norse ones in return. This two-way exchange created a genetic trail that blurred boundaries between Viking and Baltic identities. Archaeology supports this view. Mixed-style graves, containing both Norse and Baltic artifacts, show that intermarriage was common. Children buried with Scandinavian swords and Baltic ornaments embody this fusion, their DNA likely a blend of both worlds. And because DNA does not fade with memory, these unions still speak today, their legacy mapped by geneticists who find northern signatures embedded in Baltic genomes. What does this mean for modern Estonians, Latvians, and Lithuanians? It means that when they look back at their ancestry, they must see not only their own tribes, but also the Norse who came across the sea. It means that their bloodlines carry fragments of fjords alongside forests, fragments of longships alongside amber shores. It means that the story of the Baltic is not only one of resistance but also of mingling, where Viking DNA became part of the identity of the region. And this identity traveled farther still. When Baltic peoples later migrated across Europe, when they carried their genes into Poland, Germany, and beyond, they carried with them the Viking fragments absorbed centuries earlier. Thus, the Viking trail in the Baltic did not end at the shore, it spread outward, widening the Norse legacy in ways no saga could predict. We must remember, too, that DNA tells us of adaptation. Some traits common in Scandinavia, such as height-related markers and immune system variants, appear slightly elevated in Baltic populations compared to their Slavic neighbors. This may be the genetic shadow of Norse ancestors, their traits preserved in communities that once mingled with settlers from the north. Even today, when scientists map the genomes of Baltic populations, they find anomalies that point back to Scandinavia, like faint echoes of long-forgotten voyages. And yet, the Viking legacy here is not only science, it is also memory. Folk tales in the Baltic speak of sea raiders, of tall strangers with foreign tongues, of alliances and betrayals. These tales, like DNA, preserve fragments of truth, reminding us that history lives in both story and cell. So when we speak of a genetic trail in the Baltic states, we speak of a subtle path, not a blazing conquest. We speak of footprints left in soil and in blood, footprints that endured even when chronicles fell silent. The Baltic was both gateway and destination, both corridor and homeland for Norse settlers. And through DNA, we see that they did not vanish. They became part of the people, part of the landscape, part of the enduring mosaic of Europe. That is the surprise, that is the revelation, that is the saga hidden in blood. The Vikings are still here, not only in Scandinavia, not only in Britain or Ireland, but in the Baltic too, their genes whispering beneath forests and fields, reminding us that their reach was global and their story is ours. Sweden, with its forests of pine and birch, its countless lakes shimmering under northern skies, and its coasts dotted with fjords and inlets, gave rise to a particular kind of Viking, those who did not sail west toward Britain or south toward France, but eastward into the rivers and plains of Russia. These were the Swedes, the Russ, the traders and raiders who carved their destiny not on the open ocean but along the arteries of rivers like the Dnieper, the Volga, and the Neva. Their longships, shallow-bottomed and light, could be dragged across portages, allowing them to leap from river to river, turning the endless forests into highways of ambition. Archaeology shows us their presence in places like Staraya Ladiga and Novgorod, settlements that became staging grounds for journeys deeper into the Slavic world. And DNA tells us that these Swedes left more than coins and weapons behind. They left blood, mingling with Slavic, Finno-Ugric, and steppe populations to create a new genetic landscape. Studies of ancient remains from early Rus burials reveal haplogroups associated with Scandinavia, markers that prove Swedish Vikings were not only rulers but fathers, their genes flowing into the veins of local populations. Imagine a Swedish chieftain settling in Novgorod, marrying a Slavic princess, their children born at the meeting point of two worlds, carrying both Norse Y chromosomes and Slavic mitochondrial lines. Those children became the founders of dynasties, their legacy written in both history and blood. The Rurikid dynasty, for example, which ruled Kievan Rus for centuries, traced its origins to Rurik, a Swedish Viking, and while chronicles debate the details, DNA confirms Scandinavian presence in the early ruling class. This means that the roots of Russia's first great state were watered with Swedish Viking blood. And that blood did not stop at ruling families. It spread through soldiers, traders, and settlers who mingled freely with local communities. Genetic studies in northern Russia reveal higher-than-expected levels of Scandinavian ancestry, proof that these unions were widespread. Yet the Swedish path to the east was not only about conquest, it was about trade. The Swedes built networks that stretched from the Baltic to Byzantium, linking northern furs and slaves to southern silks and silver. Silver dirhams minted in Baghdad have been found in huge numbers in Swedish soil, buried in hoards by families whose sons sailed the rivers and returned with wealth. And wealth often meant wives, children, and the passing on of genes. Thus, the Viking path to the east became a biological path as well, carrying Swedish DNA deep into Eurasia. Consider the Varangian Guard, that elite force of the Byzantine emperors. Many of its members were recruited from Rus, men of Swedish descent who had settled in Russia generations earlier. When these guards served in Constantinople, they too left children behind, scattering Swedish genes into Greek and Anatolian lineages. This created a chain reaction, where bloodlines from Uppsala and Gotland traveled south into Byzantium, blending into Mediterranean populations. And sometimes the path carried them even farther. Archaeological and textual evidence suggests that Swedish Vikings reached as far as the Caspian Sea, raiding cities in what is now Iran and Azerbaijan. If they reached so far, then surely some of them left descendants, mingling with peoples of the Caucasus and Persia, leaving behind genetic footprints faint but real. This is what DNA shows us, that Viking influence was not limited to the familiar westward story of raids on England, but extended into the vast East, carried by Swedish ambition. And the legacy survives in modern populations. Genetic surveys reveal traces of Scandinavian haplogroups in Russia, Ukraine, and the Baltic states, especially in regions along old trade routes. These traces are not dominant, but they are persistent, proving that Swedish Vikings became part of the populations they once ruled. This is why we call it a path, not a conquest. For the Swedish eastward expansion was less about overwhelming numbers and more about strategic settlements, alliances, and intermarriage. Over time, Norse identity faded, replaced by Slavic culture, Orthodox faith, and local traditions, but DNA did not fade. It remained, passed silently from parent to child, century after century, until modern science uncovered it. We must ask, what does it mean that Swedish Vikings shaped the East in this way? It means that the foundations of Eastern Europe carry northern roots. It means that the Viking Age was not only about the Atlantic world but also about Eurasia. It means that when we look at the genetic map of Europe and Asia, we see faint lines stretching from Sweden to Kiev, from Gotland to Novgorod, from Burka to Byzantium. These lines are not myths, they are chromosomes, measurable, undeniable, alive in people today. Think of the ordinary lives behind this story. A Swedish trader bargaining in Novgorod, his children speaking both Norse and Slavic. A soldier serving in Kiev, marrying a local woman, his descendants forgetting their northern tongue but keeping his genes. A Varangian guard in Constantinople, leaving behind children whose Mediterranean descendants never knew their grandfather came from the forests of Sweden. These lives were the true carriers of Viking DNA, not the kings or jarls, but the countless ordinary men and women whose unions forged new identities. Archaeology supports this human story. Graves in Russia often contain both Scandinavian weapons and Slavic ornaments, mixed signals that reflect mixed ancestries. DNA from these burials confirms the fusion, showing that the Swedish path was not one of isolation but of integration. And the integration reshaped populations. Some geneticists argue that the blending of Norse and Slavic lineages contributed to the diversity of Eastern Europe, adding northern resilience to southern adaptability. If true, then the legacy of Swedish Vikings is not only historical but biological, shaping health, height, and even immunity in ways that persist. This is the hidden saga of Sweden's Viking path to the east. Not only trade routes and battles, but marriages, children, and bloodlines. Not only silver hoards, but genetic legacies that still shimmer in modern genomes. And when we trace them today, we see that Swedish Vikings did not vanish when their age ended. They endured in the DNA of millions, their path eastward written not only in sagas but in cells. That is why science is so powerful. It confirms what history hinted at but never proved. It shows us that the rivers of the East carried more than boats. They carried blood, and that blood still flows. So when you stand on the banks of the Dnieper or the Volga, imagine the longships that once glided by, imagine the men who rowed them, Imagine the children they left behind. Their story is not gone. It lives in every heartbeat, in every gene, in every trace of Viking DNA found in the East. And in this way, Sweden's Viking path to the East was not just a journey through rivers, it was a journey through time, carrying the North into the heart of Eurasia forever. Norway, land of fjords carved by ice and mountains rising like jagged spires, was the cradle of the boldest seafarers, and from its shores countless men and women set sail into the western seas, carrying not only their culture but their bloodlines. It was Norwegian Vikings who launched some of the most daring voyages, striking the British Isles, settling in Ireland, establishing kingdoms in the Hebrides, colonizing the Faroe Islands, ceding Iceland, and pushing farther still into Greenland and Vinland. Their legacy in the West was not written only in sagas of raids, but in DNA that still lingers in modern populations across the Atlantic fringe. Genetic studies reveal that the highest concentrations of Scandinavian ancestry in Britain are found in regions most heavily targeted or settled by Norwegians: Orkney, Shetland, the Hebrides, and parts of northern Scotland. These regions show Y-chromosome haplogroups common in Norway, proof that Norwegian men left descendants who became integral to local populations. Imagine a longship departing from Bergen, its crew braving gales, their destination unknown, their ambition limitless. When they landed in Orkney, they did not simply raid. They built, they married, they stayed. The Orkneyinga saga records the reign of Norse jarls who ruled for generations, and modern Arcadians still carry up to a third of their ancestry from Norway. That is not myth, that is measurable, genetic reality. In Shetland, the story is the same, with Scandinavian markers present at levels even higher than in much of mainland Britain. Here, Norwegian settlers brought entire families, and their DNA became foundational, shaping not just the present but the identity of the islands themselves. Move farther west, and the trail continues. The Faroes, settled by Norwegians in the 9th century, still show a striking genetic pattern. Male lines overwhelmingly Norse, female lines often Celtic, reflecting voyages where Norwegian men sailed with women taken from the British Isles. This pattern repeats in Iceland, where Norwegian Y chromosomes dominate but mitochondrial DNA reveals strong Celtic influence. Iceland thus became a fusion born of Norwegian ambition and British Isles heritage, a living experiment in genetic blending that persists today. And because Iceland remained isolated, its gene pool preserved this pattern with remarkable clarity, making it one of the most studied Viking legacies on Earth. From Iceland, the Norwegians leapt again into Greenland. Eric the Red, exiled from Iceland, established settlements on the island's western fjords, bringing hundreds of Norwegians to carve farms into frozen soil. Their bones, recovered from graves, show unmistakable Norwegian ancestry, yet their story is bittersweet. After centuries of struggle, the Greenland colonies disappeared, victims of climate change, isolation, and perhaps conflict with Inuit. But DNA may yet prove that they did not vanish completely. Some Inuit populations today show faint European markers that may trace back not to later explorers but to these Norse settlers, blending Norwegian genes into Arctic lineages. And beyond Greenland lay Vinland, North America, where Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red, brought Norwegian explorers to the shores of Newfoundland. Archaeology at Lance Aux Meadows confirms their presence, and genetics hints that some of these encounters produced descendants. One Icelandic lineage carries a Native American marker dated to around 1000 CE, suggesting contact and intermarriage carried back through Greenland. If so, Norwegian DNA crossed the Atlantic 5 centuries before Columbus, linking old and new worlds through unions forgotten by history. What does this mean for us today? It means that Norwegian bloodlines are not confined to fjords and valleys but spread across oceans, embedded in populations from Scotland to North America. It means that modern Arcadians, Shetlanders, Faroese, and Icelanders carry Norway within them, whether they know it or not. It means that the daring of Norwegian seafarers reshaped not only geography but genetics. And these legacies live on. In Orkney, Genetic surveys show that up to 25% of men still carry the I1 haplogroup common in Scandinavia. In Iceland, genealogical records paired with DNA confirm direct lines back to Norwegian settlers. In Greenland, bones excavated from Norse graves matched genetic profiles from Norway, proving continuity across seas. Each discovery is a reminder that history lives in blood. Consider the cultural parallels that mirror this genetic story. Place names in Orkney, Shetland, and the Hebrides, ending in I or sta, are Norse in origin, linguistic fossils that align perfectly with DNA evidence. Traditions of boat building, sheep farming, and even elements of law in these regions echo Norwegian influence. But while culture can fade, DNA does not. It persists silently, written into every cell, waiting for science to read what sagas forgot. And science has read deeply. A 2015 study comparing Scandinavian and British Isles populations revealed that Orkney and Shetland show the strongest Norwegian signal outside of Norway itself. Another study mapped the genetic heritage of Icelanders, confirming that around 75% of male ancestry traces to Norway. These numbers are staggering, proving that Norwegian Vikings were not only raiders but the primary founders of Western colonies. This genetic dominance explains why the story of Viking expansion westward is often called a Norwegian saga. For it was Norwegians who drove it, Norwegians who sailed it, Norwegians who left their blood as proof of their daring. And yet, it was never a story of Norwegians alone. The Celtic contribution in Iceland, the blending with Pictish and Gaelic women in Scotland, the possible mingling with Inuit and Native Americans, these unions remind us that Norwegian DNA did not travel untouched. It fused, it adapted, it became part of new identities. This is the true power of Norwegian legacy. It did not impose but absorbed, it did not erase but enriched. We must ask, how should we understand this legacy today? Perhaps as proof that courage and curiosity can carry genes farther than borders ever could. Perhaps as reminder that ancestry is rarely pure, always blended, always flowing. Perhaps as lesson that the daring of a few men and women in longships changed not only their world but ours. When modern Scots trace their ancestry and find Norse markers, they are uncovering this truth. When Icelanders map their family trees, they are retracing voyages from fjords to lava fields. When scientists detect faint European signals in Inuit DNA, they are hearing whispers of Greenland farms lost to snow. And when Americans of Scandinavian descent look across the Atlantic, they are continuing a connection that began 1,000 years ago with Norwegian sails on the horizon. Norway's legacy in the West is thus not only history. It is living heritage, pulsing in blood, shaping identities, reminding us that the Viking Age never truly ended. It transformed, it dispersed, it hid in chromosomes waiting for discovery. And through DNA, the Norwegians still sail, their genes carried across seas, their courage carried in cells, their story written into the very flesh of millions. That is the true saga of Norway's westward reach. Not only raids, not only settlements, but life carried forward, unbroken, unforgettable, alive today. Denmark, with its low shores, fertile plains, and harbors alive with the clatter of shipwrights, was the heart of Viking ambition, a land where kings forged fleets and launched them across every sea they could reach. From gelling stones carved with runes to longhouses where plans for conquest were drawn, Denmark pulsed with the energy of expansion, and from here the great waves of Viking raids first struck England, France, and beyond. It was Danish longships that descended upon the coast of Wessex, Danish warlords who carved the Danelaw into the heart of England, Danish kings who later ruled not only Denmark but parts of Britain in a North Sea empire. But what does DNA reveal of this reach? It reveals that Danish bloodlines spread widely across Europe, more widely than many realize, and their traces can still be measured today in the genes of millions. Genetic studies in England show that regions under the Danelaw carry higher proportions of Scandinavian ancestry than the South, with markers that align most closely to modern Danes. This means that Danish Vikings were not only conquerors but settlers, their children born in English villages, their bloodlines absorbed into the fabric of Anglo-Saxon society. Imagine the Midlands of England in the 9th century, where farmers ploughed fields under Danish law, where Norse fathers and Anglo-Saxon mothers raised children whose DNA became the foundation of future generations. Those children still live among us, their bloodlines surviving in modern English genomes that whisper of Denmark's reach. Move south to France and the story deepens. It was Danish raiders who stormed the Seine, reaching Paris, burning towns, and eventually forcing Frankish kings to grant land. That land became Normandy, a duchy ruled by descendants of Rollo, a Viking of Danish or Norwegian origin, whose dynasty carried Scandinavian DNA into French aristocracy. From Normandy, as we know, came William the Conqueror, whose invasion of England in 1066 reshaped not only politics but genetics, for Norman blood was Viking blood, and through intermarriage with English elites it carried Scandinavian markers deeper into Britain's ruling classes. Thus, Denmark's reach echoed not only in commoners but in kings. Consider also the far south. Norman expansion into Sicily and southern Italy was powered by descendants of Danish settlers in France, and through them Viking DNA entered Mediterranean lineages. The chain is clear. Danish Vikings settled in Normandy, their descendants conquered England and Sicily, and their genes scattered from Scandinavia to the Mediterranean. This is the quiet spread of DNA, far beyond the roar of battles. Denmark's reach was not limited to Europe alone. Through trade, Danish Vikings linked Scandinavia to the Islamic world, bringing silver dirhams from Baghdad back to Danish soil. Hordes of coins unearthed in Denmark prove the scale of this exchange, and wherever trade flowed, genes could flow too. Archaeological finds of mixed burials in trading hubs suggest unions between Scandinavians and foreigners, and DNA confirms that some Middle Eastern haplogroups appear in Scandinavia, just as faint northern markers appear farther south. This mutual exchange shows that Denmark was not isolated. It was a hub in a global web. And the legacy of Danish expansion can still be traced in unexpected places. Modern studies show that certain areas of Ireland, particularly along the east coast, carry significant Scandinavian ancestry tied to Viking settlements founded by Danes in Dublin, Waterford, and Limerick. These cities were not only ports of trade but ports of genes, where Danish settlers married local women, their children carrying dual heritages forward into Irish society. Even today, many Irish surnames trace back to Norse origins introduced by Danes, and genetic markers align with these histories. Denmark's influence extended across the North Sea as well. In Scotland, Danish settlers mingled with Picts and Gaels, particularly in the Hebrides and Caithness, leaving measurable DNA signatures. In the Isle of Man, Danish presence is evident in both archaeology and genetics, adding another node to the expanding web of Viking bloodlines. And across the Baltic, Danish Vikings raided and traded, leaving children in Estonia, Latvia, and along the coasts of Poland and Germany. Each of these contacts left behind fragments of Danish DNA, fragments that multiplied over centuries until they became part of the identity of those lands. We must ask, what distinguished Denmark's role from Norway's or Sweden's? The answer lies in focus. Norway reached west, Sweden reached east, but Denmark reached in all directions, striking England, France, Ireland, the Low Countries, and the Baltic. Danish expansion was wide rather than deep, scattering seeds across Europe that grew into countless lineages. This is why DNA linked to Denmark is so widespread, because Danish Vikings were everywhere, and the power of their kings magnified this reach. Harald Bluetooth, the king who united Denmark and raised the great rune stones, also Christianized his realm, tying Danish expansion to the broader currents of medieval Europe. His descendants and rivals extended influence into England, where Danish kings such as Knut the Great ruled both realms in a North Sea empire. Under Knut, Danish bloodlines intertwined with English royalty, embedding Viking DNA into the genealogies of monarchs. This fusion ensured that Danish ancestry lived not only in villages but in palaces. The spread of these lineages can be traced forward. Royal houses across Europe carry descent from these unions, meaning that Danish Viking DNA survives in aristocracy as well as in common folk. Archaeology strengthens the story. Burial mounds in Denmark contain goods from across Europe, proof of travel and contact. Bones sequenced from these graves reveal haplogroups found later in Britain and France, showing that these individuals or their descendants settled abroad. Conversely, remains found in England and Ireland reveal Scandinavian markers matching Danish profiles, proof of integration. This is the scientific validation of what sagas and chronicles suggest, that Denmark's reach was vast, persistent, and transformative. But beyond conquest and kingship lies the ordinary human story. Imagine a Danish settler in Dublin marrying an Irish woman, their child carrying both lineages into the future. Imagine a farmer in Normandy, descended from Rollo's men, passing his genes to children who would later fight at Hastings. Imagine a craftsman in York, his father Danish, his mother Anglo-Saxon, his blood a silent fusion of two worlds. These lives, countless and forgotten, are the real carriers of Denmark's reach, the ones whose DNA still speaks when chronicles fall silent. And so we see that Denmark's role in the Viking Age was not only about raids and empires, it was about legacy. Legacy written in names, in languages, in cities, but above all in blood. Today, geneticists mapping Europe find Danish markers scattered like embers across the continent. They appear in England, Ireland, France, the Baltic, even in southern Italy. Today, in the age of genome sequencing and ancestry tests, the Vikings rise from sagas and skeletons to stand revealed in the living blood of millions. What once was guessed through runes and ruins is now measured in percentages and haplogroups, bringing the Viking legacy into kitchens and laptops across the world. A person in Chicago, Dublin, or Sydney might spit into a tube, send it to a lab, and receive a report that whispers, 5% Scandinavian, 7% Norse markers, a trace of Viking DNA carried unknowingly through centuries. This is the global mystery of Viking ancestry today, a mystery not bound by fjords or castles but spread across continents. Modern genetic studies show that Viking ancestry is not confined to Scandinavia or even to regions they settled like Britain, Ireland, or Russia. It appears in surprising places, faint but real, hinting at journeys we barely remember. Consider North America, where millions claim Scandinavian roots from later migrations, yet some also carry fragments older than Ellis Island, markers possibly tied to Viking voyages to Greenland and Vinland. Icelandic families still preserve a Native American marker dated to around 1000 CE, a genetic ghost of contact across the Atlantic centuries before Columbus. This marker is global in its implication, proving that Viking DNA did not only spread east and west in Europe but crossed into the New World, linking populations in ways no textbook predicted. In Britain, Viking ancestry is clearer still. A 2015 study mapping British genomes revealed that regions under the Danelaw, Yorkshire, the East Midlands, parts of East Anglia, retain strong Scandinavian signatures. In Orkney and Shetland, the numbers are higher still, with nearly a third of ancestry tracing to Vikings, most of them Norwegian. These findings are not abstract. They are alive in people today, their height, their hair color, their immune system genes all carrying faint echoes of the North. And in Ireland, Viking ancestry runs strongest along the east coast, especially in Dublin, Waterford, and Limerick, cities founded by Norse settlers. Here surnames like Doyle or MacAuliffe conceal a genetic truth, that their bearers are as much Viking as Gaelic, as much Norse as Celtic. Even in France, the story lives on. In Normandy, descendants of Rollo's men still carry Scandinavian markers, their DNA proof that the Normans were not only culturally French but genetically Norse. And from Normandy the Viking genes traveled again, into England with William the Conqueror, into Sicily with Roger II, and into royal lineages that spread across Europe. Some modern monarchs trace descent back to Viking ancestors, meaning that Viking DNA still sits upon thrones, hidden beneath crowns. The mystery deepens in Eastern Europe. Studies of populations in Russia, Ukraine, and the Baltic reveal faint Scandinavian signals along old trade routes. These traces match haplogroups common in Sweden, confirming that the Rus and Varangians who founded Novgorod and Kiev left descendants. The very word Russia may echo this ancestry, and modern Russians may unknowingly carry Viking fragments in their blood. Even further south, the mystery continues. In Greece, Turkey, and Armenia, rare Scandinavian haplogroups appear, perhaps legacies of Varangian guardsmen who settled, married, and became part of Byzantine society. These genetic footprints are faint but undeniable, proof that Viking blood seeped into populations far from its cold origin. And what of the Middle East? Silver hoards in Sweden show contact with Baghdad, and Arab chroniclers described Norse traders in vivid detail. Genetic studies of some Caucasus and Iranian populations reveal occasional northern markers, suggesting that Viking DNA entered Muslim lands through trade, war, or slavery. Imagine a Norse mercenary taking a wife into Tabriz, their child absorbed into Persian society, their Viking heritage forgotten but carried in cells. That is the global mystery. Genes travel farther than memory, farther than history, farther than maps. Today, commercial ancestry companies reveal this truth to ordinary people. Someone in New York discovers that their Irish roots include Scandinavian fragments from Viking Dublin. Someone in Canada learns that their Scottish ancestry carries strong Norwegian markers from Orkney. Someone in Spain finds a faint northern signature, perhaps tied to Norman Sicily or Varangian service. Each revelation surprises, each revelation expands identity, each revelation proves that the Viking legacy is not gone but global. And these discoveries reshape how we see history. For centuries, the Viking Age was told as a northern story: raids on Britain, settlements in Iceland, voyages across the seas. But DNA proves it was more. It was global, it was connective, it was enduring in ways sagas never imagined. Every child born of Norse and local unions became a carrier of this legacy, and those children multiplied, spreading Viking DNA like seeds scattered in wind. The mystery lies in how far those seeds flew. They landed in Scotland and Ireland, yes, but also in Sicily and Byzantium, in Greenland and perhaps in the Americas, in Baltic forests and Persian markets. They landed everywhere the Vikings went, and everywhere they stayed long enough to leave children. And science, with its power to read the double helix, reveals them now, piece by piece, thread by thread, weaving a map of ancestry that stretches across the world. What does it mean for us today? It means that the Viking story is not just theirs, it is ours. It means that millions around the world carry their daring, their resilience, their restlessness in their very DNA. It means that the mystery of Viking ancestry is not solved but unfolding, growing clearer with every genome sequenced, every population mapped. And it means that the reach of the Viking Age was far greater than history books told, greater than sagas sung, greater than we imagined. The Vikings are not gone. They are not distant. They are alive in us, global, surprising, enduring. And that is the greatest mystery of all, that raiders who once set fire to monasteries now live in the quiet blood of their descendants, in places they never dreamed of, across a world that still carries their genes. What does Viking DNA reveal about us today? Not just about the Vikings, not just about Scandinavia, but about humanity itself, about how identities are formed, how stories are carried, and how blood remembers what words forget. For centuries, the Vikings lived in the imagination as raiders, pirates, destroyers of churches and villages, yet their DNA tells another story, one of settlement, family, and continuity. Their genes show us that raids were only the beginning, that the true legacy was not fire but life, not destruction but creation. Viking DNA reveals that history is never pure, that populations are always mixed, always blended, always carrying pieces of each other. When Norse men settled in Ireland, Scotland, or the Baltic, they did not erase locals. They joined them, fathered children, and created new peoples whose descendants live today. When Norse women crossed seas to Iceland, to Orkney, to Greenland, they carried mitochondrial lineages that still pulse through modern populations. Every cell of every descendant tells us that humanity is not static but dynamic, not divided but interconnected. Viking DNA reveals that identity is layered. The Irish are not only Celtic but partly Norse. The Scots are not only Gaelic but partly Norse. The English are not only Anglo-Saxon but partly Norse. Even the Russians, the Greeks, the Sicilians, the Greenlanders, all carry fragments of Norse ancestry in their populations. It reveals that the Viking Age was not a northern story alone, it was a global moment, part of a larger human web. And it teaches us something profound about migration. We often imagine migration as something modern, tied to airports and passports, but Viking DNA proves that migration is as old as humanity itself. People have always moved, always mingled, always carried their genes across borders and seas. The Vikings were not unique in this, but their story shows it vividly, with ships crossing oceans and genes crossing generations. And the result is that millions of us today, whether we know it or not, are part Viking. Viking DNA reveals resilience. It shows how small populations, like those who settled Iceland, survived isolation, famine, and eruption, and yet carried their genes intact into the modern age. It shows how Greenland settlers endured centuries of cold, leaving faint traces even after their colonies vanished. It shows how adaptability was coded into their blood, a trait that let them thrive from the Mediterranean to the Arctic. Viking DNA also reveals curiosity. These were people who could have stayed in fjords, farming and fishing, but who instead asked what lay beyond the horizon. That question is written into their legacy, and perhaps into their descendants. The restlessness, the wanderlust, the urge to travel and explore may in part be a cultural inheritance, but it is also echoed in biology, in the fact that their genes spread wider than almost any other medieval people. Viking DNA reveals unity in diversity. It tells us that while cultures may war, while chronicles may divide, our blood remembers connections. A Norman in Sicily and a farmer in Orkney might seem worlds apart, yet both carried Viking markers. A Russian noble of Rurikid descent and an Irish fisherman in Dublin both carried Norse ancestry. This unity is a reminder that humanity is one great web, and the Vikings are one thread among many, but a thread that wove widely. Viking DNA reveals the truth of sagas and the silence of history. It confirms that Vinland was real, that contact with Native Americans left traces, that tales once dismissed as myth carry genetic echoes. It also fills gaps where chronicles are silent, showing us unions never recorded, children never named, families never written but preserved in chromosomes. Blood does not lie. It remembers what parchment forgot. Viking DNA reveals surprise. It appears in Sicily, in Armenia, in Greenland, in places we never expected. It shocks us when an Icelander carries a Native American marker, or when a Sicilian genome reveals a northern haplogroup. It forces us to rethink what we thought we knew, to accept that history is more complex, more interconnected, more human than we imagined. Viking DNA reveals us to ourselves. It shows us that no one is pure, no one is isolated, no one is untouched. We are all mixtures, all descendants of countless unions across time, all carriers of histories we may never know. To find Viking DNA in yourself is not just to find raiders, it is to find farmers, settlers, mothers, fathers, children. It is to find the resilience to survive ice, the courage to cross seas, the curiosity to ask what lies beyond. Viking DNA reveals that the past is not gone. It lives in us. Every heartbeat, every breath, every cell carries stories written not in ink but in nucleotides. Stories of fjords and longships, of swords and sagas, of love and fear, of journeys beyond the horizon. And those stories remind us that we too are part of a larger tale, one still unfolding, one still written in blood. So what does Viking DNA reveal about us? That we are not separate peoples but shared peoples. That our differences are smaller than our connections. That history is not only in books but in bodies. That the Vikings, like all ancestors, are not gone but alive in us. And that to know our DNA is to know ourselves, to know that the past is not behind but within. Viking DNA reveals the enduring truth of humanity, that we are wanderers, minglers, survivors, dreamers. That we carry in ourselves the courage of those who faced storms, the resilience of those who endured famine, the ambition of those who built kingdoms, the curiosity of those who crossed oceans. And that revelation is not only about them, it is about us. We are their legacy. We are their descendants. We are the living Vikings, in ways great and small, in blood and in spirit. And through our DNA, their story continues. Forever.
The Vikings are not gone. They live in us. Their blood flows in millions across the globe. History is not only in books, it is in our DNA. If you enjoyed this journey, share your thoughts below. What surprised you the most? Your comments guide our next adventure. Best of luck.